period commonly referred to as the Neolithic Age represents one of the most gradual yet consequential transformations in human history. It marks the long arc during which communities in various parts of the world shifted from predominantly mobile foraging lifeways toward more settled forms of existence based on cultivation, animal management, and increasingly complex material technologies. Archaeological research indicates that this transition unfolded over several millennia, beginning in parts of Southwest Asia around the 10th millennium BCE and appearing independently in regions such as East Asia, Africa, and the Americas in later periods. Although the pace and sequence of developments differed widely, the cumulative result was a profound reorganization of human interaction with landscapes, resources, and social structures. Geographically, the Neolithic cannot be confined to a single region. Its earliest expressions are documented across the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia and into the Zagros foothills. In these areas, climatic changes at the end of the Pleistocene created environments where wild cereals, pulses, and herd animals thrived. Communities that had long gathered these resources became increasingly familiar with their seasonal cycles, spatial distributions, and ecological behaviors. Similar patterns of localized intensification appear in the Yellow River Basin in China, in the New Guinea highlands, and in parts of Mesoamerica, each shaped by distinct climates, flora, and fauna. Rather than a universal model, the Neolithic is best understood as a constellation of regionally specific adaptations to changing environmental opportunities and constraints. Research suggests that the transition was neither abrupt nor uniformly purposeful. Many groups continued to rely on diverse subsistence strategies, combining foraging with small-scale cultivation or animal tending. Early settlements often remained modest in size, occupied seasonally or intermittently, and organized around structures made from local materials. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological data reveal gradual shifts in plant morphology, herd composition, and site permanence, indicating extended periods of experimentation before fully domesticated species and stable agricultural systems emerged. These processes created new forms of daily labor, new spatial arrangements within settlements, and new rhythms of life tied to cyclical tasks such as sowing, harvesting, and herd management. The Neolithic also witnessed transformations in social and symbolic spheres. Excavations of early villages show changes in household arrangements, communal facilities, and ritual architecture. Figurines, decorated tools, and symbolic motifs appear in increasing diversity, reflecting evolving conceptions of identity, ancestry, and community belonging. Burial practices, too, shifted in ways that suggest more formalized relationships with land and lineage. While the meaning of these practices remains a subject of scholarly debate, they point to a growing complexity in the ways communities understood their social worlds. Chronologically, the Neolithic spans a broad temporal range, ending earlier in some regions and later in others. In Southwest Asia, it gradually transitions into the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age as metallurgy, expanded trade, and emerging forms of hierarchy take shape. In other parts of the world, Neolithic lifeways persisted well into the 2nd millennium BCE, and in some areas even longer. This variability underscores that the Neolithic is not a singular moment, but a long continuum of change shaped by regional histories. Understanding the Neolithic requires a balanced view of environmental dynamics, technological innovations, and social adjustments. It involves tracing how communities negotiated their surroundings, organized their labor, and expressed collective identities. With this broader landscape established, attention can turn to the specific phases through which the Neolithic unfolded, beginning with the late Pleistocene conditions that framed the earliest developments. The late Pleistocene landscape, stretching from roughly 20,000 to 10,000 BCE, was a world shaped by shifting climates, expanding and contracting ecosystems, and the continuous movement of human groups who adjusted their lifeways to changing conditions. Across Eurasia, Africa, and parts of the Near East, temperatures oscillated between colder and milder phases, creating environments in which resources appeared, vanished, and reappeared according to rhythms not yet fully stable. Research indicates that these oscillations significantly influenced the distribution of plants and animals, encouraging flexible strategies among foraging communities who learned to read these shifts through repeated seasonal patterns. In many regions, the last glacial maximum had recently passed. Ice sheets that once covered vast areas of the northern hemisphere began to retreat, leaving behind exposed plains, river valleys, and newly forming wetlands. Vegetation zones shifted in response. Open steppe landscapes persisted in colder belts, while temperate woodlands began to develop in areas receiving greater warmth and moisture. These transitions unfolded slowly, yet they produced noticeable changes in the availability of edible plants, usable wood, and wild game. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities responded by adjusting their movement across these landscapes, orienting themselves toward zones where water, plant stands, and animal herds remained relatively stable throughout the year. In the Levant, groups associated with the later Epipaleolithic period constructed a diverse subsistence base that combined the gathering of wild cereals, the hunting of gazelle and other medium-sized animals, and the use of freshwater resources. Sites such as those of the Natufian tradition illustrate how some communities developed semi-sedentary patterns of occupation, returning to favored locations where plant stands and hunting opportunities coincided with predictable seasons. Excavated structures, including circular dwellings built of stone foundations, indicate recurring use rather than permanent settlement. These sites provide glimpses into social arrangements characterized by shared food processing areas, hearths, and communal activity zones. Although interpretations vary, such patterns suggest that certain groups found environmental niches where mobility could be reduced without jeopardizing their capacity to meet seasonal needs. Elsewhere in Eurasia, conditions differed. In East Asia, particularly in regions surrounding the Yellow River Basin, foraging communities navigated landscapes dominated by grasses, small-seeded plants, and a variety of forest-edge resources. The archaeological record shows stone tools adapted for cutting, grinding, and processing plant materials that would later become central to early cultivation practices. Environmental studies of pollen and sediment layers indicate that climatic improvement during the terminal Pleistocene supported greater vegetation diversity, offering a wide range of seasonal foods. Communities moved through riverine corridors and upland zones, targeting ripening periods of grasses, nuts, and fruits, while continuing to hunt and fish in accordance with local ecologies. In northern Africa, including areas of the Nile Valley and adjacent savannas, human groups operated within landscapes that experienced both aridity and episodic increases in rainfall. These climatic variations affected the presence of herd animals, freshwater sources, and plant clusters along riverbanks and seasonal lakes. Archaeological evidence points to flexible subsistence practices involving hunting of antelope, exploitation of fish, and collection of wild grains. As in other regions, mobility patterns responded to environmental shifts, with groups adjusting their routes to follow the movements of herds or to access water points during drier intervals. Across these regions, technological adaptations reveal how communities refine their strategies. Microliths, small, precisely shaped stone fragments, were hafted into composite tools used for hunting, butchering, and plant processing. Bone implements show signs of wear associated with tasks such as hide working, fishing, and weaving plant fibers into cords or nets. Ground stone tools, including mortars and grinding slabs, appear in increasing frequency toward the end of the Pleistocene. These tools signal intensified processing of plant materials and reflect daily routines that required collaborative labor within households or small groups. The rhythms of life during this period depended greatly on seasonal cycles. Groups often returned to particular locales where resources peaked at predictable times. Such patterns did not constitute permanent settlement, yet they produced a form of familiarity with certain landscapes that shaped cultural traditions. Over generations, knowledge of when certain plants ripened, when herds migrated, and when rivers produced the most fish became embedded within communal practices. These patterns formed the cognitive groundwork that later allowed communities to recognize opportunities for more intentional resource management. Climatic fluctuations, however, continued to challenge stability. One of the most significant was the Younger Dryas, a sudden cooling event beginning around 10,900 BCE. Environmental data from lake cores, glacial deposits, and pollen sequences show abrupt declines in temperature across large portions of the northern hemisphere. Woodlands retreated, open steppe environments expanded, and the availability of wild cereals in some Near Eastern regions decreased. Research suggests that these changes encouraged groups to employ more intensive harvesting methods, possibly leading to repeated disturbance of local plant stands. While scholars debate the precise mechanisms, many agree that these disruptions shaped subsequent decisions about plant management in some regions. The Younger Dryas did not affect all areas equally. In East Asia, changes appear to have been more moderate, though shifts in precipitation created new distributions of grasses and small-seeded plants. Communities continued to adjust their movements, exploiting pockets of stability within broader ecological fluctuations. In Africa, the impact varied from region to region, influencing the breadth of hunting territories and the seasonal reliability of water sources. Throughout this long period, foraging communities maintained social structures suited to mobility and cooperation. Archaeological evidence suggests small group sizes, flexible membership, and shared responsibilities in gathering, hunting, and tool production. Burial practices in several regions indicate a growing diversity of symbolic behavior, with some sites showing grave goods, personal ornaments, or patterned arrangements of the deceased. These practices reflect varied forms of social identity and communal memory, even within societies that lacked fixed settlements. Artifacts from this era also show emerging regional styles in lithic technology and personal adornment. Patterns in stone tool design, bead types, and decorative motifs allow archaeologists to trace cultural affiliations across wide areas. These stylistic traditions reinforce the view that late Pleistocene communities, though dispersed, maintained connections through shared practices, intergroup contact, and possibly seasonal aggregation. As the Pleistocene drew to a close, the combined influence of climatic variability, technological refinement, and accumulated ecological knowledge shaped a world in which certain communities became increasingly attentive to specific plant and animal behaviors. These patterns did not yet constitute agriculture or settlement, but they created conditions in which such developments could eventually emerge. As ecological conditions continued to shift near the end of the Pleistocene, communities across different regions refined their responses to the opportunities and challenges presented by their surroundings. Landscapes that had once been dominated by glacial influence gradually warmed, allowing new plant communities and animal populations to expand into formerly inhospitable areas. River systems changed course, wetlands developed or receded, and forest edges shifted their boundaries in ways that required close observation from the human groups who relied upon them. Such gradual transformations shaped not only subsistence practices, but also patterns of mobility and social interaction. Along the Levantine corridor, foraging groups affiliated with later Epipaleolithic traditions began to rely more consistently on specific locales, where combinations of plant resources, hunting grounds, and freshwater remained dependable across seasons. Excavated sites show a mixture of stone-built foundations, hearths, and storage-like depressions, suggesting repeated occupation. Though still mobile, communities incorporated these locations into cyclical movements that balanced resource diversity with predictable seasonal returns. Archaeological interpretations vary regarding the degree of permanence these patterns represent, yet many studies emphasize that the familiarity developed through repeated visits likely encouraged closer attention to the growth cycles of wild cereals and legumes. In the foothills of the Zagros and the mountains of southeastern Anatolia, the late Pleistocene environment supported an array of wild sheep, goats, and gazelles. Herd movements through upland valleys created seasonal opportunities for hunting, and groups often coordinated their activities around these predictable patterns. Stone tool assemblages from these regions reveal carefully shaped microliths suitable for hunting small to medium-sized animals. Repeated use of specific hunting corridors implies long-term ecological knowledge, built gradually over generations of observing animal behavior within particular landscapes. Such knowledge would later become a foundation for more directed interactions with herd animals, though at this stage communities maintained highly flexible strategies. In East Asia, particularly within the Yellow River Basin and its adjacent plateaus, communities encountered environments where grasses and small-seeded plants flourished. Sediment analyses show increasing ecological diversity as temperatures moderated. Communities gathered a variety of grasses that would much later become associated with early forms of cultivation. Stone querns and grinding slabs recovered from sites of this period indicate that processing of plant materials was already a significant component of daily labor. The presence of these tools suggests cooperative activities focused on gathering and preparing plant foods, tasks that often required multiple individuals working in coordinated sequences. Northern Africa, including regions bordering what would become the Sahara, experienced shifting climatic patterns that alternated between relative moisture and aridity. During wetter intervals, lakes and river systems expanded, attracting both human groups and large herds of animals. Fishing, hunting, and plant gathering formed a flexible triad of subsistence strategies. When aridity returned, groups adjusted by moving toward more reliable water sources, including the Nile Valley. These changing conditions contributed to dynamic patterns of mobility that allowed communities to preserve access to essential resources over long periods. Throughout these continents, the archaeological record points to an increasingly rich diversity of material culture. Ground stone tools began appearing in greater quantities. Their forms reflect repeated motions of grinding, polishing, and crushing, tasks that typically require a stable working surface and extended periods of labor. Such tools were likely used to process nuts, seeds, and grains that were harvested in larger quantities as knowledge of seasonal cycles deepened. Bone tools, including needles, points, and hooks, demonstrate the continued importance of fishing and sewing technologies. These implements reflect everyday practices rather than specialized craft, forming the basis of material traditions that remained central well into the early Holocene. Social organization during this period appears to have been highly adaptable. Households or small kin-based groups seem to have served as the primary units of activity, with responsibilities distributed according to seasonal needs. Archaeological research at various sites shows signs of communal action, such as shared hearths or areas used for collective processing of plant materials. Seasonal aggregation may have occurred at resource-rich locations, where multiple groups came together to exchange knowledge, maintain social ties, and cooperate in large-scale hunting or gathering tasks. Evidence for such gatherings appears indirectly through the density of tools, hearths, and disposal patterns found in certain layers. Symbolic practices also continued to develop. Personal ornaments made from beads, shells, and pierced stones indicate the importance of identity and affiliation within mobile societies. Even in regions far from coastlines, marine shells appear in burial contexts, implying long-distance exchange networks. These ornaments may have carried social meaning related to group identity, individual status, or shared beliefs. However, interpretations remain varied, and scholars emphasize the caution required when inferring symbolic behavior from material traces. Burial evidence from parts of Southwest Asia and Europe suggests that some communities engaged in increasingly formalized treatment of the dead. In certain Natufian sites, individuals were interred within or near habitation areas, sometimes accompanied by items such as beads, tools, or animal remains. The presence of such burials indicates a form of continuity between living spaces and ancestral memory. Other regions show more ephemeral burial traditions, consistent with higher mobility. These variations underscore the diverse ways in which late Pleistocene societies navigated questions of identity, memory, and belonging. The Younger Dryas, with its abrupt return to cooler conditions, disrupted many of the ecological stability patterns communities had come to rely upon. In the Levant, the contraction of woodland species and the reduced availability of wild cereals may have placed greater pressure on resource gathering. Research suggests that in some areas, groups intensified their harvesting practices, returning to the same plant stands more frequently and potentially altering local plant dynamics. Though these changes did not constitute agriculture, they represent steps toward closer human involvement in the life cycles of certain species. Other regions navigated the Younger Dryas with different strategies. In East Asia, communities shifted toward areas that maintained consistent moisture. In Northern Africa, mobility routes expanded to accommodate the changing reliability of water sources. Across all these landscapes, flexibility remained essential. Subsistence strategies broadened or narrowed depending on local conditions, and communities relied on accumulated knowledge to maintain continuity in the face of environmental uncertainty. By the end of this long period, the Pleistocene world was giving way to the early Holocene. Warmer temperatures, expanding plant communities, and increasingly stable climatic conditions created new ecological opportunities. The knowledge accumulated by foraging groups over millennia provided a foundation upon which later practices could develop. Patterns of movement, resource selection, community coordination, and symbolic expression had already formed a complex tapestry of human adaptation. As these landscapes settled into a new climatic phase, the foraging strategies of the late Pleistocene began to merge gradually with new possibilities emerging across various regions. These possibilities would soon reshape the relationships between communities, their environments, and the resources upon which they depended. In these quieter transitions, the groundwork for later developments took shape, resting within the routines and observations that had guided generations. The transition from the late Pleistocene into the early Holocene marks one of the most significant environmental shifts in human prehistory. Beginning around 9600 BCE, large portions of the Northern Hemisphere entered a period of gradual warming that followed many millennia of climatic oscillation. Ice sheets that had once covered vast expanses of Eurasia and North America continued their retreat, releasing meltwater into river systems and reshaping coastlines. As temperatures rose, precipitation patterns changed, and ecosystems reorganized themselves in response to new combinations of warmth, moisture, and seasonal stability. These broad climatic developments created environments that were more predictable and more diverse, opening ecological possibilities that foraging communities had not previously encountered on such a scale. In Southwest Asia, pollen sequences from lake cores and cave deposits show a marked expansion of woodland species soon after the onset of the Holocene. Oak, pistachio forests spread across foothills and upland zones, creating habitats rich in edible nuts, browse for herd animals, and timber suitable for construction. The spread of these woodlands did not occur uniformly, yet their presence signaled a general increase in environmental productivity. Alongside these forests, wild cereals and pulses flourished in ecotones where sunlight, rainfall, and soil conditions aligned in favorable ways. Such expansions offered foraging groups new concentrations of plant resources that ripened at predictable times of year, allowing communities to gather foods in larger quantities with reduced uncertainty compared to earlier periods. In regions surrounding the Jordan Valley and the upper Euphrates, settlements that had already shown tendencies toward repeated occupation now found themselves situated within increasingly stable landscapes. Water sources became more reliable as precipitation increased, and natural stands of wild barley and wheat formed dense clusters along slopes and river terraces. Research indicates that communities began to recognize these plant zones as dependable features of the environment. Their harvesting cycles became more patterned, and the movement between resource areas became more structured around the timing of ripening seasons. Although these communities remained fundamentally foragers, their strategies reflected a deeper familiarity with the rhythms of the Holocene landscape. Further east, in the highlands of Iran and the Zagros Mountains, the Holocene brought similar ecological changes. Warmer conditions supported the spread of grasses and shrubs favored by sheep and goats. Herd animals responded by adjusting their migratory routes, now guided by new growth in upland meadows and seasonal pastures. Foraging groups who had long followed these animals across varied terrains continued to adapt their movements to the changing patterns. Archaeozoological evidence suggests that communities tracked these herds with increasing regularity, learning which valleys offered the earliest spring growth and which slopes supported vegetation well into the autumn. This accumulated knowledge would later shape the earliest stages of herd management, though at this point, human-animal relationships remained rooted in hunting and observation rather than active control. In East Asia, the onset of the Holocene produced a different configuration of ecological opportunities. Across the Yellow River Basin, rising temperatures supported the expansion of grasses that would centuries later become key species for early cultivation. Sediment analyses from this region indicate that floodplains became more stable, creating environments where seasonal floods deposited nutrient-rich sediments. These floodplains supported a wide spectrum of small-seeded plants, wild fruits, and riparian resources. Communities moved through these landscapes in ways consistent with foraging lifeways, yet their activities began to revolve more closely around the cyclical availability of these grasses. Grinding stones from archaeological sites show wear patterns consistent with the processing of small grains, suggesting that plant foods formed a significant and growing portion of daily subsistence. In South Asia, and particularly along the Indus River system, warming climates gradually enhanced the productivity of floodplain environments. Although full Holocene stability would take additional time to develop, early phases of increased moisture supported wider distributions of grasses and wetland plants. Seasonal floods created ecological mosaics that could support both plant gathering and the hunting of animals drawn to water-rich environments. Communities exploited these mosaics through flexible movements that balanced the pursuit of game with the harvesting of aquatic and shoreline resources. These patterns were not unique to this region, yet they illustrate the variety of ways Holocene environments shaped human strategies. North Africa likewise experienced profound environmental reorganization. Areas that would later become part of the Sahara still supported savanna-like conditions during the early Holocene. Increased rainfall produced lakes, river channels, and grasslands that nourished herds of antelope and other large mammals. Human groups navigated these landscapes by following seasonal availability of plant foods and water, moving between lake margins, dunes, and upland zones. Archaeological evidence indicates that fishing and the gathering of wetland plants formed important components of subsistence during wetter intervals. These activities reveal a deep sensitivity to environmental variation, one that remained essential as conditions gradually shifted again in later millennia. Across all these regions, the Holocene introduced a level of ecological reliability that differed from the climatic unpredictability of the preceding period. Warmer temperatures reduced the frequency of abrupt climatic reversals, while increased moisture supported more continuous plant growth. Foraging groups responded by modifying their movement strategies. While mobility remained fundamental, the distances traveled between seasonal resource zones began to shrink in some areas. Communities stayed longer in locations where multiple resources overlapped, where wild cereals ripened near water sources, or where forest edges provided both nuts and game. These behaviors did not create permanent settlements, but they encouraged repeated occupation of specific places, reinforcing knowledge of local ecologies and deepening connections to familiar landscapes. The refinement of plant observation during this period is particularly significant. Archaeobotanical studies show that communities became increasingly attuned to the growth patterns, spatial clustering, and seasonal rhythms of certain plants. This knowledge was not abstract. It grew from generations of harvesting, gathering, and processing experiences, transmitted through routine practices rather than deliberate experimentation. Some scholars suggest that groups began returning to plant stands more frequently during peak ripening seasons, unintentionally influencing the regeneration of these stands. While such interactions fall short of cultivation, they reflect a growing awareness of plant behavior within stable Holocene climates. The rise of these new environments also reshaped social rhythms. Seasonal gatherings at ecologically rich areas may have become more regular as predictable resources encouraged groups to congregate. The presence of shared hearths, cooking installations, and refuse zones at several early Holocene sites indicates communal activities that extended across multiple families. Such gatherings likely facilitated the exchange of information about landscapes, weather patterns, and resource cycles, strengthening cultural cohesion across regions. As the early Holocene progressed, these environmental opportunities laid the foundation for later developments in plant management, animal exploitation, and localized settlement. The landscape itself had changed, and communities responded in ways that reflected both deep continuity with earlier lifeways and subtle adjustments to new ecological possibilities. As Holocene climates stabilized further, landscapes across many regions developed ecological patterns that foraging communities could anticipate with growing confidence. Rivers established more consistent courses, wetlands expanded across low-lying areas, and forest boundaries settled into new configurations. These shifts did not create uniform conditions across continents, yet they reduced the frequency of sharp climatic fluctuations that had characterized the late Pleistocene. Such stability allowed plants and animals to adopt more predictable life cycles, and human groups began to organize their movements in closer alignment with these rhythms. In parts of Southwest Asia, especially within the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, the early Holocene fostered the expansion of plant species that thrived in warmer and moister settings. Wild barley and wheat formed dense patches along foothills, and pulses such as lentils and chickpeas grew in scattered clusters across suitable slopes. The distribution of these edible plants created zones of seasonal abundance that communities learned to navigate with precision. Archaeobotanical records show increases in the quantity of charred plant remains at early Holocene sites, suggesting more intensive gathering during ripening periods. These patterns reflect a growing dependence on plant-based foods, not as a full subsistence system, but as an increasingly stable component of seasonal diets. The predictability of these resources encouraged longer stays at favored locations. Excavated dwellings from this period often show signs of repeated reconstruction or refurbishment, implying that communities returned to them year after year. Floors were resurfaced, RTHS rebuilt, and storage pits renewed in ways that indicate cyclical use. Although such places did not yet form fully settled villages, they represent an important step toward localized stability. Their repeated use helped communities recognize subtle changes in plant behavior from year to year, strengthening the ecological knowledge required for future cultivation practices. Further east, in the Zagros Highlands, the presence of early Holocene oak, pistachia woodlands provided both food resources and suitable habitats for large mammals. Herds of sheep, goats, and gazelles moved through these environments along relatively consistent routes. Foraging communities followed these herds, adjusting their movements to seasonal variations in vegetation and animal behavior. Archaeozoological data show shifts in the age profiles of hunted animals during this period, which some researchers interpret as early signs of selective hunting. These patterns may reflect growing attention to herd structure and renewal cycles, though interpretations remain cautious. What is clear is that the early Holocene landscape supported increasingly structured relationships between human groups and herd animals, relationships rooted in observation and patterned movement rather than domestication. In East Asia, climatic stability supported the persistence of grassland ecologies across the Yellow River Basin. Communities who navigated these environments continued gathering a wide array of grasses and small-seeded plants. The use of grinding stones became more widespread, reflecting the increased importance of plant foods in daily life. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Nanjuangtu and associated localities shows that communities processed plant materials with methods that required cooperative labor and time. These practices indicate a growing investment in plant processing, even as mobility remained essential in other aspects of life. The environmental conditions of the early Holocene encouraged this investment by offering landscapes where plant resources persisted reliably across seasons. North Africa likewise experienced ecological opportunities that shaped human strategies. Increased rainfall created lakes and riverine systems that supported broad bands of vegetation across what would later become arid zones. These lakes attracted herds of wild cattle, antelope, and other large mammals. Communities moved among lake margins, wetlands, and adjacent grasslands, exploiting fish, waterfowl, and plant stands. Stone tool assemblages from early Holocene sites show evidence of both hunting technologies and plant processing implements, reflecting a balanced subsistence system suited to variable yet resource-rich environments. Over time, these conditions allowed for more structured seasonal movements, guided by plant growth and water availability. In Europe, the retreat of the final ice sheets opened new territories to both animals and humans. Forests expanded across the continent, creating environments where hazelnuts, berries, and forest game flourished. Foraging groups who had once roamed steppe-like landscapes now encountered wooded terrain that demanded different strategies. Archaeological evidence from Mesolithic sites shows toolkits adapted for forest hunting and plant gathering. Seasonal patterns became closely tied to woodland resources, and groups moved between river valleys, upland forests, and coastal zones in tune with these cycles. Though distinct from developments in Southwest Asia or East Asia, these European shifts illustrate the broader phenomenon of Holocene ecological diversification. Across all these regions, the early Holocene encouraged closer relationships between communities and specific places. These relationships grew not from intentional settlement, but from repeated familiarity. Over generations, groups recognized subtle features of the landscape, where springs remained active during dry months, where certain cereals grew thickest, where animals clustered during transitional seasons. This accumulated knowledge allowed communities to construct increasingly efficient resource strategies. The environmental regularity of the Holocene made such strategies more dependable, and over time, they became deeply embedded within cultural traditions. Social practices also responded to these new conditions. At sites with repeated seasonal occupation, communal structures or shared activity areas began to appear. These features varied widely in form and function. Some were simple open spaces where cooking, tool production, or grain processing took place. Others show traces of purposeful construction, suggesting collective gatherings or ritual use. The presence of such structures indicates that communities invested more effort in places that offered recurrent seasonal advantages. These investments signaled a shift in the relationship between mobility and place, where the meaning of certain locales extended beyond immediate subsist and needs. Trade and exchange networks likewise developed within these dynamic environments. Obsidian, marine shells, and distinctive forms of stone tools appear far from their places of origin, indicating contact between groups separated by significant distances. These exchanges likely occurred during seasonal aggregations, when communities gathered to share information, renew social ties, and participate in cooperative activities. The new environmental stability of the Holocene may have facilitated these interactions by allowing predictable meeting points tied to resource cycles. By the middle of the early Holocene, landscapes in many regions supported a wide range of ecological niches. These niches allowed communities to refine their knowledge of plant behavior, develop patterned movements between resource zones, and establish the first sustained relationships with specific places. None of these developments amounted to agricultural dependence, nor did they form permanent settlements. Yet they formed an essential ecological and cultural groundwork. As communities moved through the warming world, their practices increasingly reflected an understanding that certain places could be relied upon year after year. In these environments, the seeds of later developments took quiet shape. Patterns of movement grew more focused, harvesting cycles became more regular, and the possibilities for more sustained interaction with particular species emerged gradually. Within the calm stability of the early Holocene, communities continued to adapt, building upon inherited knowledge while responding to landscapes that were themselves in the midst of long transformation. Between roughly 9500 and 8000 BCE, communities across several regions of Southwest Asia, East Asia, and parts of southeastern Anatolia entered a phase of increasingly deliberate engagement with key plant and animal species. This period did not mark the appearance of fully formed agriculture, nor did it represent a clear break from earlier foraging traditions. Instead, it formed a long transitional interval during which human groups began to influence the reproductive cycles of plants and animals in ways that earlier societies had not. Archaeological and environmental evidence from this period illustrates gradual, uneven, and regionally diverse processes through which cultivation and early herd management emerged as extensions of long-standing ecological knowledge. In the northern Levant, sites such as Jerf El Arma and Murabit provide some of the clearest early indications of intentional plant management. Excavations reveal repeated use of structures associated with food processing, including grinding installations and storage areas embedded within domestic spaces. Charred plant remains from these settlements show increasing frequencies of wild cereals, such as barley and einkorn wheat. Although these plants were still morphologically wild, their presence in concentrated quantities suggests that communities were harvesting from stands that had become more predictable and possibly more resilient due to repeated human disturbance. Archaeobotanical studies indicate that groups may have removed competing vegetation, cleared pathways for harvesting, and gradually encouraged the growth of preferred species by returning to the same plant zones across successive years. Further north and east, in the foothills of the Taurus and Zagros ranges, communities such as those associated with Sayanu constructed settlements with clear internal organization, including dedicated spaces for storage, food preparation, and communal activity. Faunal remains from these sites reveal shifts in the species and age profiles of hunted animals. Sheep and goats appear more frequently, and patterns of culling suggest increasing selection of younger males alongside the retention of females. While these patterns do not yet represent full domestication, they indicate an emerging interest in controlling herd composition. Archaeozoologists interpret these changes as early steps toward herd management, rooted in intimate knowledge of animal behavior gained through generations of hunting and close seasonal proximity to migrating herds. In East Asia, particularly within early Yellow River Basin settlements, similar yet distinct developments occurred. Communities began gathering plant species such as broomcorn millet, which thrived in the temperate grasslands of the region. Grinding stones and milling tools from these sites show wear patterns associated with the processing of small-seeded plants. Sediment samples reveal patches of soil with characteristics suggesting repeated disturbance, possibly due to early cultivation-like activities such as clearing and scraping. Although the scale of these efforts remained modest, the increasing presence of these plants in archaeological layers indicates a growing reliance on species that responded well to human presence and predictable seasonal patterns. Climate played a central role in shaping these developments. The early Holocene offered warmth, steady precipitation in many regions, and expanding ecological niches for both plants and animals. Wild cereals in Southwest Asia produced more abundant stands under these conditions, and herd animals found stable grazing grounds in upland and lowland zones alike. These environmental shifts provided communities with opportunities to intensify their harvesting without fully relocating their settlements. The predictability of these resources, combined with long-standing knowledge of their growth cycles, encouraged more directed interactions. This pattern appears not as deliberate innovation, but as an incremental extension of practices already present in late Pleistocene foraging societies. At many sites, evidence for cultivation and early animal management appears, alongside continued reliance on hunting, gathering, and fishing. Plant remains show that wild fruits, nuts, and legumes remained important components of subsistence. Faunal remains include diverse species hunted opportunistically. Seasonal mobility persisted, though within a narrower range than seen in earlier millennia. These patterns demonstrate that early cultivation and animal management did not replace foraging, but existed alongside it, forming hybrid systems of subsistence adapted to regional ecologies and cultural preferences. The architectural features of early Holocene settlements provide further insights into evolving lifeways. Buildings constructed from mud brick, timber, and stone often exhibit standardized shapes, sometimes arranged around open courtyards or shared workspaces. The presence of St. pits, silos, and granary-like structures in several early sites suggests that communities were beginning to accumulate plant foods in quantities exceeding immediate consumption. Such storage reflects confidence in future harvests and marks an important step towards sustained cultivation. It also implies more complex scheduling of labor, as tasks such as planting, gathering, drying, and storing required coordinated timing within and among households. The biological evidence for plant domestication during this period remains subtle but meaningful. Seeds recovered from early Holocene sites show occasional increases in size, thickness of glumes, and other traits associated with early human selection. These changes were gradual and uneven across regions, indicating that domestication was not a uniform or rapid process. Instead, communities likely selected seeds from plants that were easier to harvest, produced greater yields, or withstood repeated disturbance. Over time, these choices influenced the composition of plant stands, slowly shaping the earliest domesticated lineages. Animal domestication followed similarly incremental pathways. In Southwest Asia, shifts in herd demographics reflect early human control over survival and reproduction. Goat and sheep populations show signs of selective culling, with fewer adult males and sustained numbers of females. Though these herds remained partly wild, such patterns indicate regular contact between humans and specific groups of animals. Pigs appear in archaeological contexts in both Anatolia and parts of eastern China, though their domestication pathways likely differed by region. In all cases, early management practices emerged through repeated encounters, selective hunting, and subtle manipulation of herd movement rather than through deliberate breeding programs. The early Holocene also saw transformations in the social organization of labor. The processing of cereals and pulses required coordinated effort, harvesting with flint blades, transporting sheaves, grinding with stone tools, and storing the resulting flour or grain. These tasks likely involved multiple individuals working in succession, forming predictable cycles of work tied to seasonal rhythms. Such cycles encouraged more structured community interactions and may have contributed to emerging distinctions among households in terms of skill sets and responsibilities. These developments unfolded gradually, often imperceptibly within a single generation. Yet their cumulative impact reshaped the relationship between communities and their environments. As cultivation and early management practices deepened, the boundaries between wild and managed landscapes became increasingly fluid, reflecting a world in transition. Through small, repeated acts, clearing weeds, selecting seeds, tending stands, guiding herds along familiar routes, communities began to influence the very species upon which they depended. Across the landscapes of the early Holocene, the cumulative effects of repeated plant gathering, patterned harvesting, and selective hunting began to reshape ecological zones in perceptible ways. By visiting the same stands of cereals and pulses at consistent times each year, communities altered the composition of these plant clusters. Disturbance caused by harvesting tools, trampling, and the clearing of competing vegetation created conditions that favored the regrowth of plants beneficial to human use. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates that wild cereals such as einkorn, emmer, and barley responded positively to such disturbances, producing denser stands in subsequent growing seasons. Although communities did not yet cultivate these plants in formal fields, their repeated engagement with favorable patches initiated subtle changes that encouraged the dominance of preferred species. These behavioral patterns also influenced the organization of settlements. Many early Holocene sites show architectural expansions that reflect changing relationships with local resources. Structures at settlements such as Seanu exhibit increasing standardization and careful planning, suggesting coordinated activities within and across households. Rooms designated for storage became more prevalent, and some buildings appear to have served collective functions, possibly associated with food processing or communal gatherings. Although interpretations vary, these features indicate that groups were beginning to spend longer periods in specific locales, supported by increasingly reliable plant and animal resources. At Jerf El Ama along the Euphrates, excavations reveal circular and rectangular buildings arranged around communal spaces. Some structures contain features associated with large-scale food preparation, including deep bins, grinding installations, and complex floor surfaces shaped and resurfaced multiple times. These architectural elements point to intensive work centered on cereals and pulses, activities that likely occurred during peak harvesting seasons. The presence of such facilities suggests that communities anticipated the annual availability of plant resources and prepared spaces for their efficient processing. In the Zagros and Taurus regions, the gradual shift toward greater involvement with herd animals gained momentum. Faunal remains from early Holocene layers show that sheep and goats became increasingly prominent in subsistence assemblages. Demographic profiles reveal patterns consistent with selective removal of young males, a strategy that could sustain herd numbers while maximizing meat yields. While the animals remained genetically wild, such management practices reflect a growing degree of human influence over their survival and reproduction. This form of engagement required careful observation of herd behavior, knowledge of movement patterns, and the capacity to influence grazing routes by taking advantage of natural terrain features. These developments unfolded within broader social contexts shaped by long-standing traditions of mobility, cooperation, and shared knowledge. The processing of plant foods, for example, often required collective labor. Grinding cereals on heavy stone slabs was a physically demanding and time-consuming task, and archaeological evidence suggests that it was often done in clusters of households working side by side. Such arrangements may have strengthened social cohesion, reinforcing bonds within communities that now spent more time within defined settlement spaces. Although mobility did not disappear, it became more structured, with movements timed around seasonal resource cycles and gradually anchored by recurring tasks associated with plant and animal management. In East Asia, the cultivation-related patterns observed in the Yellow River Basin followed their own trajectory. Communities gathered wild millet using harvesting tools suited to small-seeded grasses. As they returned to the same gathering grounds each year, they likely contributed to the spread of millet through unintentional seed dispersal. Grinding stones, mortars, and pestles recovered from these sites show heavy wear, evidence of prolonged use in processing grains. While the morphological signs of domestication in millet would not become prominent until later periods, the behavioral foundations for its cultivation were already emerging. The combination of stable Holocene climates and the predictable growth cycles of millet created conditions in which repeated engagement could gradually evolve into more deliberate planting. Pig domestication is another example of regionally distinct processes. In parts of eastern China, faunal analyses show increasing frequencies of pig remains with demographic patterns suggesting closer human interaction. Some pigs appear to have been raised near settlements, indicated by changes in diet inferred from isotopic studies and by the presence of juvenile individuals in contexts suggesting human care. These developments emerged gradually, and in many areas wild hunting continued alongside early management practices. Nevertheless, the growing association between human settlements and pig populations reflects an early phase of domestication shaped by local ecological conditions and community traditions. Across Southwest Asia, plant domestication proceeded at varying rates. In some areas, morphological changes in cereals began to appear, including tougher rachises in which grains remained attached to the stalk rather than dispersing naturally. This trait is a key indicator of domestication, as it facilitates harvesting but rarely evolves without sustained human influence. Its emergence in scattered sites suggests that cultivation-related practices, such as sowing collected seeds, clearing competing plants, and harvesting selectively, had begun to exert evolutionary pressures on cereal populations. These changes were neither rapid nor universal, but they illustrate how repeated interactions between communities and plant stands gradually shaped the species that would later form the foundation of agricultural economies. Social dynamics also shifted subtly during this transitional period. As plant and animal resources grew more dependable, communities gained the ability to store surplus foods for use during less productive seasons. Storage reduced the immediate pressures of daily subsistence and allowed for greater flexibility in organizing labor. It also created new social possibilities. Households responsible for maintaining storage facilities might have specialized in particular tasks, such as seed preparation or animal tending, although the archaeological record remains limited in confirming such distinctions. What can be observed is that storage technologies, pits, bins, baskets, and clay-lined chambers became more common and more elaborately constructed. In settlements where early cultivation and animal management took firmer root, traces of increasing sedentism appear. Floors were surfaced through multiple occupation phases, walls were rebuilt following consistent plans, and tools were deposited in patterns suggesting long-term spatial organization within households. These features indicate that communities were beginning to invest more heavily in particular places, strengthening connections to landscapes that supported their emerging resource strategies. At the same time, many groups maintained aspects of mobility, especially in regions where plant stands or herd movements were less predictable. The coexistence of sedentary tendencies with continued mobility remains a defining characteristic of this transitional era. Across all regions, the developments between 9500 and 8000 BCE represent a convergence of environmental opportunity, inherited ecological knowledge, and incremental shifts in human behavior. Communities did not set out to invent agriculture or domestication. Rather, they deepened their engagement with species that had long been part of their subsistence systems, responding to the steady rhythms of the Holocene with practices that gradually altered the relationships between humans, plants, and animals. As these practices continued, landscapes around settlements changed in subtle ways. Plant species that responded well to repeated harvesting became more abundant. Herd animals grew more accustomed to human presence. Storage facilities grew in number and complexity. Within these quiet adjustments, the foundations of future agricultural societies took shape, resting upon the familiarity, patience, and accumulated knowledge of early Holocene communities. Between roughly 9000 and 7000 BCE, a notable shift occurred in several regions of Southwest Asia and beyond. Communities that had once relied on flexible mobility began to spend longer periods within particular locales. This shift did not happen abruptly. It unfolded gradually, shaped by the growing predictability of Holocene climates, by the increasing reliability of cultivated plants and managed herds, and by generational familiarity with specific landscapes. Archaeological remains from settlements such as Abu-Huraira, Beidha, and Satal-Huruk illustrate the emergence of early village forms, clusters of houses arranged in patterns that demonstrate a changing relationship between communities and the places they inhabited. In the Euphrates basin, Abu-Huraira shows some of the earliest evidence for increasingly permanent structures. Excavations reveal a transition from circular, semi-subterranean dwellings of earlier phases to more substantial rectangular buildings constructed above ground. These structures, made of mud brick and supported by wooden elements, were repaired and rebuilt over successive occupations. Floors were plastered repeatedly, forming smooth surfaces that reflect deliberate maintenance. Hearths, storage pits, and work areas were positioned within these houses in consistent ways, suggesting that households organized their living spaces around stable routines. The cumulative layering of floors and walls at the site indicates long-term continuity of occupation, marking a clear departure from patterns of seasonal return. At Beidha, located in the Petra region of southern Jordan, similar architectural developments occurred. Clusters of houses constructed from stone and mud brick show careful planning, with walls aligned in consistent orientations and doorways leading into small courtyards or workspaces. These houses were built closely together, forming compact neighborhoods that limited movement between structures. Such arrangements imply a level of social coordination, as households negotiated spatial boundaries and shared external areas. The presence of storage bins within houses further suggests that families expected to remain in place long enough to accumulate and manage supplies. As these settlements grew more established, their internal layouts reveal new forms of community organization. Pathways emerged between clusters of houses, worn by repeated foot traffic. Open areas functioned as communal spaces for food processing, tool manufacture, or social interaction. Some sites show evidence of shared facilities, such as communal ovens or designated work zones, indicating cooperation among households. These arrangements reveal a gradually thickening social fabric, woven through activities that took place not only within domestic spaces, but also in shared environments linking multiple families. In Anatolia, Çatalhöyük represents one of the most striking examples of early village complexity. Although its main occupation extended beyond the timeframe of this chapter, its early levels illustrate many features characteristic of emerging permanent settlements. Houses at the site were packed tightly together, often sharing walls. Movement occurred primarily across rooftops rather than through ground-level streets. Interior spaces were carefully arranged, with platforms, storage areas, and hearths reflecting established household routines. The repeated rebuilding of houses in the same locations over generations created a deep stratigraphy of superimposed structures, each layer preserving traces of daily life. Such stratigraphy reflects strong continuity, suggesting that communities regarded specific places within the settlement as meaningful across long periods. Across all these regions, the appearance of more permanent structures marks a fundamental change in the relationship between communities and the land. Earlier foragers had relied on seasonal movement to track the availability of resources, but as cultivation intensified and herds became more predictable, groups began to invest in fixed architecture. Building with mud brick or stone required sustained labor and the expectation of long-term use. Plastered floors needed periodic renewal. Storage facilities demanded consistent monitoring to protect food from pests or moisture. These responsibilities anchored households to their dwellings, reinforcing the cycle of permanence. Permanence, in turn, reshaped the organization of daily labor. Tasks once distributed across wide landscapes now concentrated around households and shared spaces within settlements. Grinding grain, tending stored foods, and maintaining structures required coordinated routines. Children grew up within stable architectural settings, learning tasks associated with household maintenance and food processing from an early age. Elders participated in the continuity of these practices, preserving knowledge that now tied strongly to built environments rather than shifting seasonal routes. The rhythms of life became more spatially constrained, yet more socially interconnected. As households anchored themselves to define spaces, the boundaries between families gained greater significance. Architectural patterns show repeated use of similar house forms, indicating that households maintained a degree of autonomy while participating in broader community frameworks. Doorways and interior arrangements suggest careful consideration of domestic privacy and shared engagement. Courtyards between clusters of houses served as transitional zones, spaces where individual and communal activities overlapped. Archaeologists interpret these spaces as areas where food was processed, tools were repaired, and interactions between households took place. Through such interactions, the social structure of early villages gradually emerged. At the same time, the permanence of settlements required communities to manage their surrounding landscapes more intensively. Fields or plant stands located near settlements needed tending. Herds that grazed in nearby areas required periodic guidance or protection. The reliability of cultivated plants encouraged households to remain close during critical growing periods, while the storage of harvested foods enabled them to weather less productive seasons without relocating. These new patterns of resource use further anchored communities to their chosen locations, gradually reinforcing the distinction between settlement spaces and the landscapes beyond them. The increase in permanence also fostered new forms of material expression. Plastered floors, sometimes renewed with layers of carefully applied lime, reveal attention to the maintenance of interior spaces. Some sites show early evidence of wall decoration, including simple motifs or impressions made during plastering. While the symbolic meanings remain uncertain, these features reflect an emerging sense of place, as households invested time and care into their living environments. Tools, containers, and decorative objects began to accumulate within houses, forming material assemblages that reflect longer-term residence rather than temporary occupation. Across regions, these developments varied in pace and form. Some communities adopted permanent structures quickly, while others maintained more mobile lifeways for longer periods. Environmental conditions played a significant role. Regions with reliable plant stands or stable herding opportunities supported earlier transitions, while areas with less predictable resources continued to rely on mobility. Yet despite this variability, the period between 9000 and 7000 BCE marks a broader pattern of increasing settlement stability across multiple regions. Within these early villages, daily life unfolded according to routines shaped by both tradition and new forms of organization. Households engaged in tasks that required sustained attention, while communities cooperated in managing shared spaces. These settlements did not yet possess the social hierarchies or large-scale planning found in later agricultural centers. Instead, they represent an intermediate stage, where permanence emerged through practical needs and accumulated familiarity rather than through formalized social structures. As these early villages grew in size and complexity, they laid the foundations for subsequent developments in craft production, ritual expression, and long-distance interaction. Their architectural forms, household routines, and community arrangements reflect the first sustained step towards settlement-based lifeways that would eventually shape the trajectory of Neolithic societies across multiple regions. As early villages continued to develop between 9000 and 7000 BCE, their architectural patterns became increasingly consistent, reflecting a deeper commitment to place and the gradual emergence of stable community identities. Houses were no longer simple shelters erected for short-term use. Instead, they became durable structures that required planning, skilled construction, and repeated maintenance. The labor invested in building and preserving these spaces demonstrates that communities anticipated long-term residence, and with that expectation came new forms of social coordination and environmental management. In the Levant, settlements such as Beidha show clear evidence of architectural standardization. Houses built of stone foundations and mud brick walls followed similar dimensions, often arranged in clusters that appeared to reflect social units larger than single households. Some structures opened onto small courtyards where food processing took place, including the grinding of cereals and the preparation of meals. These courtyards formed important transitional spaces, linking the privacy of domestic interiors with the shared environment of the wider settlement. The presence of multiple adjacent courtyards suggests that households maintained close relationships with their neighbors, engaging in daily exchanges that reinforced social cohesion. At Abu Huraira, the progression from earlier round dwellings to rectangular buildings marks a significant architectural transition. Rectilinear plans allowed for more efficient use of space and facilitated the construction of multiple rooms or compartments within a single household. These internal divisions often corresponded to specific tasks: one area for sleeping, another for storage, a third for grinding grain or preparing food. The repetition of these architectural forms across the settlement indicates shared ideas about domestic organization. Even though households remained relatively autonomous units, their interior layouts reveal common preferences for how daily life should be structured in a more permanent setting. The increasing permanence of dwellings also encouraged the accumulation of materials that reflected continuity over time. Tools were stored within houses, sometimes placed in corners or embedded in floor surfaces when floors were renewed. Hearths were rebuilt repeatedly in the same locations, forming layers of ash and burnt material that testify to years of continuous use. Storage pits were repaired or deepened, demonstrating that households planned for the retention of surplus foods from one season to the next. These practices mark a significant shift from earlier periods when storage had been limited to temporary solutions suitable for mobile groups. In Anatolia, Çatalhöyük offers the most elaborate example of early village life during this era, even though its later flourishing extends beyond the strict timeframe of this chapter. The earliest levels demonstrate an already substantial commitment to permanent living spaces. Houses were constructed tightly against one another, eliminating the need for streets at ground level. Entry occurred through rooftop openings accessed by ladders. This arrangement may have developed in response to limited space within a dense settlement or as a way to protect interior areas from external conditions. The rooftop pathways created an interconnected network of movement, linking households through shared routes while maintaining the distinct boundaries of each home. The degree of continuity at Çatalhöyük is particularly notable. As houses aged, they were often demolished and rebuilt in the same location, following similar dimensions and internal layouts. This pattern of rebuilding indicates that specific spaces carried significance for the households who occupied them. The repeated investment in the same locations created a deep vertical sequence of habitation layers, each representing generations of community life within a steadily expanding settlement. Such continuity suggests strong attachments to place, shaped by memory, routine, and the familiarity of established domestic environments. As settlements became more permanent, their relationship with the surrounding landscape changed in fundamental ways. Cultivated fields or favored plant stands near settlements required regular attention, especially during planting and harvesting seasons. These tasks encouraged households to remain near their fields rather than moving across wide territories. The proximity of resources supported year-round occupation or extended seasonal residence, blurring the earlier patterns of mobility that had defined foraging lifeways. Even communities that continued to incorporate hunting or seasonal movement into their subsistence strategies tended to anchor themselves to village centers, using them as fixed bases from which excursions were made. Herding practices likewise supported settlement permanence. Sheep and goats, increasingly managed during this period, needed to be monitored and occasionally guided between grazing areas. Such activities were easier to coordinate from stable settlements where households shared responsibilities for herd management. Faunal remains from early villages show increased proportions of these species relative to others, suggesting that communities relied more heavily on animals that could be kept near human structures for at least part of the year. This proximity required constructed spaces, pens, enclosures, or designated outdoor areas that further tied human activity to the settlement landscape. As households invested more in their built environments, the social implications became more pronounced. Permanent settlements required new forms of cooperation to maintain shared spaces, manage resources, and coordinate labor. Pathways between houses had to remain clear. Communal areas needed upkeep, and shared facilities, such as ovens or workspaces, required collective oversight. These activities likely strengthened social bonds and created expectations for mutual responsibility within the village. While clear evidence of formal leadership or hierarchy is limited in this period, the organization of settlement spaces suggests that decisions were made cooperatively and that social norms develop. To guide daily interactions. The growing complexity of village life also influenced craft practices. With greater permanence, households had more time and space to refine tool-making, pottery production, and other specialized activities. Early plastered floors and wall surfaces show signs of careful workmanship, reflecting technical skills that developed through repeated practice. The presence of decorative elements, simple paint, incised patterns, or textured plaster indicates that communities valued not only the functionality of their dwellings, but also their aesthetic qualities. Such expressions may have reinforced communal identity or marked particular households within the settlement. Storage, an increasingly central aspect of early village life, further transformed social dynamics. The ability to store cereals, pulses, and dried foods reduced the immediate pressures of subsistence and allowed households to withstand seasonal variability. Storage also required systems to protect accumulated resources, including containers, bins, and architectural features designed to regulate temperature and moisture. In some settlements, storage facilities appear to have been shared, suggesting cooperative strategies for managing surplus. These arrangements would have required trust and communication, reinforcing social cohesion within the community. Environmental stability during this period provided the backdrop for these developments. Warmer temperatures and stable precipitation supported reliable growing seasons, allowing communities to plan their activities around predictable cycles. Over time, the familiarity gained from repeated years of planting, harvesting, and animal tending strengthened the connection between settlements and their surrounding landscapes. This connection formed the basis for increasingly complex lifeways in later millennia. As the period between 9000 and 7000 BCE drew to a close, early villages had become central features of human organization in many regions. Their houses, pathways, courtyards, and storage structures reflected both inherited traditions and new adaptations to permanent living. Within these built environments, daily life unfolded according to seasonal rhythms and community expectations. Without forming rigid hierarchies or large-scale political structures, these early settlements nonetheless shaped the cultural and economic foundations upon which later Neolithic developments would rest. Between roughly 9000 and 6000 BCE, the rhythms of daily life across early Neolithic communities became increasingly shaped by tasks centered within households and their immediate surroundings. As settlements became more stable and cultivation practices deepened, economic activity shifted toward routines that unfolded within defined domestic spaces. These households did not function as isolated units. They formed interconnected networks of labor, resource sharing, and cooperative production. Yet the daily tasks undertaken within individual dwellings, grinding grain, preparing food, tending animals, crafting tools, formed the foundation of economic life in this period. Food preparation was one of the most consistent elements of Neolithic domestic activity. The processing of cereals and pulses required sustained labor, typically anchored within household interiors or adjacent courtyards. Large grinding slabs, mortars, and querns became common features of domestic spaces. Their surfaces show repetitive wear patterns, evidence of long hours spent reducing grain into flour or paste. Such tasks were essential for transforming harvested cereals into edible forms, and the tools used suggest that processing occurred on a scale suitable for household consumption rather than large communal storage. Ground stone implements found in settlements across Southwest Asia, Anatolia, and the Levant demonstrate a shared technological foundation, even as communities varied in the specific crops they processed. Cooking practices also reflect the growing complexity of household routines. Hearths built into floors or positioned along walls served as focal points of daily activity. Many hearths show successive layers of ash, indicating repeated use across seasons and years. Residues found in some hearths suggest the preparation of porridges, baked breads, or stews made from cereals, legumes, and occasionally animal fats. Clay-lined pits and simple ovens appear in several sites, allowing for more controlled heat and expanded cooking techniques. The presence of these features within houses suggests that food preparation was integrated into the broader flow of domestic life, shaping daily and seasonal rhythms. Animal management also took on new forms during this era. As herds of sheep and goats became increasingly tied to settlements, tasks involving their care developed into routine household responsibilities. These duties included guiding animals to grazing areas, protecting them from predators, and monitoring their health and reproduction. Faunal remains from sites such as Çatalhöyük and Ganj Dere show demographic patterns consistent with deliberate herd control, including selective culling of young males and the retention of breeding females. Although herd management varied across regions depending on environmental conditions, the overall trend indicates that households played a central role in maintaining and expanding early domesticated animal populations. Textile production emerged gradually during this period, supported by the development of spinning and weaving technologies. Spindle whorls, small, perforated objects used to spin fibers, appear in increasing numbers across Neolithic settlements. Their presence suggests that households produced threads for cords, nets, or early fabrics. Impressions found on clay fragments at some sites indicate the use of woven materials, though complete textiles rarely survive. Plant fibers, animal hair, and wool from the earliest managed sheep populations may have served as raw materials. The production of textiles required skill and repetition, making it well-suited to household labor embedded within daily routines. Pottery, though not uniformly adopted across all regions during this period, became increasingly common in many Neolithic settlements. Early clay vessels, often simple in shape and undecorated, provided new possibilities for storage, cooking, and the transport of liquids. Their appearance marks a significant technological shift, as pottery allowed food to be heated more evenly and stored more securely. In some regions, pottery production developed into a specialized craft involving the selection of clay, mixing with tempering materials, shaping by hand, and firing in open hearths or simple kilns. The earliest vessels tended to be thick-walled and utilitarian, yet they reflect an important expansion of household capabilities. Stone tool production continued to evolve, with households participating in the shaping, repairing, and resharpening of flint blades, scrapers, and other implements. The introduction of polished stone tools, particularly axes and adzes, allowed for more efficient woodworking. These tools supported tasks such as constructing houses, reshaping floor surfaces, and preparing beams or posts. Polished stone tools required substantial labor to manufacture, indicating a high degree of skill and a clear investment in durable implements. Such tools also contributed to broad transformations in settlement architecture and landscape modification. Storage practices provide insight into the growing stability of household economies. Food resources, particularly cereals, pulses, dried fruits, and animal products, were kept in a range of containers, including baskets, clay vessels, and pits lined with plaster or clay. Storage pits were often located within houses, sometimes beneath floors or built into walls. Their construction reflects careful planning, as stored foods needed to be protected from moisture, pests, and seasonal temperature fluctuations. The presence of multiple storage installations within a single household suggests that families anticipated the need to manage supplies across extended periods, reinforcing the increasingly sedentary nature of Neolithic lifeways. Variation across regions shaped the specifics of household production and economic activity. In the Levant, households tended to rely heavily on cereals and pulses, reflecting the availability of wild and early domesticated species in the surrounding landscapes. In Anatolia, communities balanced plant-based subsistence with substantial animal management, particularly of sheep and goats. In East Asia, households focused on processing small-seeded grasses and constructing tools suited to those tasks. The degree of pottery use also varied. Some regions employed ceramic vessels widely, while others continued to rely on baskets, wooden containers, or stone bowls. Despite these differences, common themes emerge across regions. Neolithic households became centers of production, storage, and consumption, shaping the economic foundations of early agricultural societies. Their activities were cyclical, aligned with seasonal planting and harvesting, animal birthing cycles, and shifts in temperature and daylight. These rhythms structured community life, influencing when households worked independently and when they cooperated with neighbors. Labor within households was likely distributed according to age, skill, and tradition. Although the archaeological record cannot reveal precise roles, the diversity of tasks, food processing, animal tending, textile production, tool-making, and construction, suggests a dynamic and interconnected division of labor. Tools associated with grinding, weaving, or pottery often appear together in domestic contexts, forming assemblages that reflect the multifunctional nature of Neolithic households. The stability provided by more permanent settlements encouraged households to accumulate objects that reflected their daily routines. Grinding stones, ceramic vessels, polished tools, and ornamental items gradually formed material collections that persisted across generations. These objects reveal not only the tasks performed within households, but also the emerging sense of continuity that accompanied settlement-based lifeways. As each year unfolded, the cadence of daily tasks followed familiar patterns anchored in the relationship between households, their environments, and the cycles of cultivation and herd management. Within these rhythms, early Neolithic communities developed routines that would, over time, support even more complex economic systems and social arrangements. As Neolithic households deepened their investment in cultivation and animal management, daily routines became anchored in cycles of preparation, maintenance, and careful observation. Tasks varied across seasons, yet each season brought predictable demands that shaped the rhythm of village life. The late winter months required the inspection and repair of storage facilities, ensuring that grains and pulses remained dry and viable for planting or consumption. Early spring often marked the beginning of field preparation, as households worked to clear weeds, break compacted soil, and plan the distribution of crops according to local conditions. These tasks were labor-intensive and depended heavily on cooperation among neighboring families, particularly where land lay in close proximity to houses. During the growing season, communities maintained a close relationship with their surrounding landscapes. Cultivated plots needed periodic tending, especially in regions where early domesticated plants competed with wild species. Tasks such as weeding, monitoring animal incursions, and safeguarding fields from pests required frequent attention. Although households largely worked independently, the shared nature of the agricultural environment fostered informal systems of cooperation. Archaeological evidence from several regions, including subtle field boundaries, repeated soil disturbances, and paths worn toward cultivation areas, suggests that communities collectively shaped their agricultural surroundings over many generations. Herd management also carried distinct daily and seasonal routines. Sheep, goats, and in some regions, early cattle were brought near settlements for parts of the year, either to graze on nearby vegetation or to remain in constructed enclosures during nights or harsh weather. Morning hours often involved guiding animals to grazing areas, a task that required knowledge of seasonal plant growth and water availability. Evening activities typically centered on bringing animals back toward settlement boundaries, where they could be monitored more easily. These routines fostered close relationships between households and the animals they tended, gradually reinforcing the patterns that supported early domestication. The integration of animals into daily life contributed not only to subsistence, but also to secondary activities such as the production of bone tools, hides, and the earliest forms of fleece-based textiles. Bone awls, needles, and spatulas recovered from Neolithic settlements show signs of careful shaping and repeated use. Their presence illustrates how byproducts of herding supported various household tasks. Hide processing, for example, required specific tools and extended labor, producing materials useful for clothing, containers, and floor coverings. Though the earliest wool-bearing sheep would not appear until later, the gradual refinement of textile techniques during this period laid important foundations for later weaving traditions. Pottery production, where adopted, added another dimension to household economies. While early ceramics were often simple and utilitarian, their manufacture required skill in preparing clay, forming vessels, and controlling firing conditions. The presence of broken sherds near houses, sometimes arranged in discrete clusters, suggests that vessel production or repair occurred in household courtyards or adjacent workspaces. Some vessels were used for cooking, their surfaces marked by soot. Others stored liquid or dried foods, protecting them from pests and moisture. The spread of pottery across different regions varied, yet even its limited adoption signaled a growing reliance on durable containers that enhanced household autonomy and long-term planning. Craft production extended beyond pottery. Households manufactured stone tools suited to a wide range of tasks. Flint knapping produced blades, scrapers, and points, each with specific uses in food preparation, hide working, or plant processing. Polished stone axes allowed for more effective woodworking, enabling communities to shape beams, posts, and floor materials with increasing precision. The production of these polished implements required extended periods of grinding and smoothing, indicating labor that unfolded across many days, often within domestic settings. The steady accumulation of polished tools in Neolithic sites highlights the importance of household-based craftsmanship in shaping built environments and enabling more sophisticated construction techniques. Household economies were not solely focused on utilitarian production. Decorative and symbolic items appear in increasing numbers during this period, including beads, pendants, and figurines made from stone, bone, or clay. Though interpretations of their meaning vary, these objects reflect the interplay of daily life and symbolic expression within households. Their presence in domestic contexts suggests that craft production also served aesthetic or ritual functions, enriching the social fabric of early settlements. The skills required to produce these items were likely passed down through generations, embedding cultural traditions within the material world of the household. The rhythms of daily life were also shaped by food storage, which created a temporal bridge between seasons. Households built storage installations beneath floors, within wall recesses, or in separate annexes. Storage was essential not only for surviving lean months, but also for organizing future labor. The availability of stored grain allowed households to time their planting more effectively, while stored pulses provided protein sources during seasons when hunting or herding yielded fewer returns. The construction of storage spaces often involved plaster linings, clay reinforcements, or woven baskets placed within pits. These installations reveal detailed knowledge of moisture control, temperature stability, and pest management, skills developed through long experience in handling plant foods. As household responsibilities expanded, so too did the social networks that supported them. In many settlements, archaeological evidence indicates shared processing areas, suggesting that groups of households worked together during peak labor periods such as harvests. This cooperation may have extended to communal meals, shared construction projects, and coordinated herding strategies. Although each household managed its own supplies and tools, the interdependence among neighbors strengthened community cohesion and created social frameworks that would prove essential as settlements grew in size and complexity. Regional variability remained significant throughout this period. In parts of the Levant, in Upper Mesopotamia, households focused heavily on cereals and pulses, reflecting the abundance of these species and the gradual appearance of domesticated traits. In Anatolia, animal management played a more prominent role, with households balancing cultivation with intensive herding. In East Asia, households relied extensively on small-seeded grasses, and their daily routines reflected the particular labor requirements of processing these plants. Pottery adoption likewise differed by region, with some cultures embracing ceramics early and others maintaining alternative storage and cooking methods. Despite this diversity, the centrality of the household as the primary economic unit remained consistent across regions. Households coordinated the tasks vital to survival, maintained tools and structures, and preserved knowledge essential to subsistence. Their activities formed the backbone of Neolithic lifeways, establishing patterns that would continue to evolve in subsequent millennia. As the period between 9000 and 6000 BCE progressed, household production systems became increasingly refined. Tasks once carried out with improvised tools or flexible schedules became embedded in structured routines. The objects accumulated within households, grinding stones, ceramic vessels, polished tools, and ornaments, formed material archives of daily experience. Through these quiet routines, early Neolithic households shaped the economic, social, and cultural foundations of emerging village life, creating settled traditions rooted in the rhythms of work, cooperation, and familiarity with the surrounding landscape. Between approximately 9000 and 6000 BCE, the increasingly settled lifeways of Neolithic communities brought with them new forms of social organization. As households clustered into villages and shared routines shaped daily life, communities developed spatial arrangements and symbolic practices that reflected evolving social relationships. These developments were gradual, emerging from earlier patterns of cooperation, but the presence of more permanent architecture, long-term residence, and expanding ritual expression created conditions in which social structures became more formalized. In many early settlements, households formed clusters that reveal both physical proximity and social interconnectedness. Dwellings built closely together, often sharing walls or arranged around small courtyards, illustrate the density of community life. Such clustering is visible at sites across Southwest Asia, including the early levels of Çatalhöyük, Beydha, and communities in the Upper Tigris and Euphrates regions. The repetition of similar house forms within these clusters indicates a degree of shared architectural tradition, while the careful placement of doorways, platforms, and work areas suggests that households navigated daily interactions through established spatial conventions. These domestic arrangements reflect a world where cooperation and negotiation shaped how people lived alongside one another. Communal spaces within settlements provide further insight into social organization. Excavations reveal open areas used for group activities, including food processing, tool manufacture, and gatherings that required shared labor. Some settlements contain large structures interpreted as communal buildings, possibly used for meetings, storage, or collective rituals. At sites such as Jurf El Arma, elongated buildings with internal benches and carefully prepared floors indicate spaces set apart from ordinary domestic life. Their precise function remains a subject of scholarly debate, yet their scale and form suggest that communities recognized the need for places where collective activities could occur beyond the confines of individual households. Storage facilities also played a role in community structure. While many stores were household-based, some settlements feature larger pits or built structures that appear to have served multiple families. These installations hint at shared responsibilities for safeguarding important resources or managing food reserves across seasons. The cooperative use of such facilities implies social expectations that transcended household units, reinforcing communal ties and supporting collective resilience during periods of scarcity. Burial practices provide a second key window into Neolithic social organization. Across many regions, individuals were interred within or near residential structures, embedding the presence of ancestors directly into daily life. At Çatalhöyük, burials were placed beneath house floors, sometimes accompanied by beads, tools, or other objects. As houses were rebuilt over generations, these ancestral remains accumulated, creating layered associations between households and those who had lived there before. The placement of burials within domestic spaces suggests that ancestors held significant emotional and symbolic importance, reinforcing household identity and continuity. Other sites reveal varied burial traditions. In the Levant, some settlements show communal burial areas or multiple individuals interred within shared spaces. Differences in burial treatment, such as the presence of grave goods or particular postures, may reflect differing social roles, relationships, or forms of status not expressed through monumental architecture. While evidence for pronounced hierarchy remains limited during this period, subtle distinctions in burial practices hint at the emergence of differentiated social roles within communities. The presence of ritual architecture marks another significant development in early Neolithic social life. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia stands as one of the most striking examples. Although the precise social meanings of its monumental stone enclosures remain debated, the scale and craftsmanship of the structures suggest that they served as focal points for ceremonial gatherings. Large T-shaped pillars, carved with images of animals and abstract symbols, form circular and oval enclosures that required considerable labor investment. These structures were distinct from domestic buildings, indicating that communal or ritual activities took place in spaces deliberately set apart from everyday life. The construction and use of such sites imply forms of coordination and shared purpose that extended across multiple communities. The organization required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect the massive pillars points to cooperative labor on a scale exceeding ordinary household tasks. While these structures do not necessarily imply formal leadership or hierarchy, they suggest that communities recognized certain roles, such as skilled stoneworkers, ritual practitioners, or organizers, whose responsibilities supported collective endeavors. Symbolic objects found within settlements provide further clues to emerging social identities. Figurines made from clay, stone, or bone appear in many Neolithic sites. Their forms vary widely. Some depict human figures, others animals, and still others abstract shapes. Interpretations differ, but many researchers argue that these objects held symbolic or ritual significance tied to community beliefs. Their distribution across houses and communal spaces indicates that symbolic expression permeated both domestic and social spheres. Wall paintings offer another dimension of symbolic life. At Çatalhöyük, interior walls were periodically replastered and decorated with geometric patterns, animal imagery, or scenes that may have held ritual importance. The repetition of such motifs across multiple houses suggests shared symbolic repertoires that contributed to communal identity. The act of creating, renewing, and maintaining these images likely formed a recurring part of household and community practices, linking social groups through common visual traditions. As settlements expanded, responsibilities within communities became more varied. Archaeological evidence points to emerging specialization in certain tasks, such as stone tool production, plaster preparation, or animal tending. While not yet formalized into occupational roles, These patterns suggest that individuals or households sometimes assumed particular responsibilities based on skill or proximity to resources. Spatial analyses of artifacts, such as concentrations of flint waste or clusters of grinding stones, reveal areas where specific activities were undertaken repeatedly, forming recognizable zones within settlements. The interplay between daily life and ritual expression shaped community cohesion. Ritual spaces and symbolic practices helped reinforce shared identities, while communal buildings and coordinated labor supported collective needs. These developments formed a social framework suited to increasingly sedentary lifeways. As households remained in one place for longer periods, their connections to neighbors, ancestors, and shared traditions deepened. Through the maintenance of domestic spaces, participation in communal activities, and engagement with symbolic expression, communities wove social structures durable enough to sustain generations of settled living. As settled communities matured between 9000 and 6000 BCE, the social landscapes within which households operated became increasingly layered. New architectural arrangements, repeated patterns of ritual activity, and enduring ties to place contributed to a social fabric in which cooperation, memory, and shared identity played central roles. These processes unfolded slowly, shaped by the physical environment of the settlements, as well as by the rhythms of subsistence work and the symbolic practices that connected people to one another. Within growing villages, household clusters formed the basic units of community organization. These clusters frequently consisted of houses built side by side, reinforcing long-term relationships among neighboring families. Their close proximity required careful negotiation of shared spaces, pathways, courtyards, working areas, and refuse zones where daily interactions occurred. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Beidha and Ashikli Höyük indicates that households oriented their entrances, work areas, and outdoor installations in ways that accommodated the presence and activities of neighboring groups. These spatial choices illustrate an emerging sense of mutual awareness, shaped by the need to manage social closeness within compact settlements. Communal activity was essential for maintaining settlement infrastructure. In many villages, pathways needed periodic clearing, shared ovens required upkeep, and refuse areas had to be managed to ensure hygiene and accessibility. The presence of carefully maintained surfaces, repeated plastering of communal walls, and organized deposition of waste reflect coordinated efforts among households. Even without formal leadership structures, these tasks required implicit agreements and shared expectations that bound communities together through practical necessity. In some settlements, particularly those with more substantial architecture, evidence points to spaces that served collective purposes distinct from domestic routines. Large rectangular or circular rooms, sometimes featuring benches or platforms, appear in multiple early Neolithic sites. Their size, location, and construction suggest that they hosted gatherings, whether for planning communal work, resolving disputes, or participating in ritual practices. While the precise functions of these buildings remain open to interpretation, their presence underscores the importance of shared spaces within early village life. Burial customs continued to express social and symbolic relationships within communities. At Çatalhöyük, individuals were interred beneath platforms inside houses, often accompanied by beads, tools, or pigment. These burials created layered connections between living households and their ancestors, embedding family histories within the architectural fabric of the settlement. As houses were rebuilt directly above the remains of previous occupants, a sense of continuity developed, with descendants living atop the material traces of earlier generations. In some cases, skulls were removed from burials and curated within households, a practice interpreted by some scholars as a form of ancestor veneration or symbolic remembrance. These curated remains were often plastered or decorated, suggesting intentional engagement with ancestral identity. Other sites exhibit different mortuary traditions. In the Jordan Valley and northern Syria, some settlements reveal collective burial areas separate from houses. These may have functioned as communal spaces for remembering the dead, reinforcing broader community identities rather than household-specific lineages. Variation in burial treatments, such as body position, inclusion of grave goods, or placement within specific areas, may reflect distinctions related to age, social roles, or kinship ties. Although clear evidence for hierarchical differentiation remains limited, these practices hint at emerging social roles expressed through mortuary behavior. Ritual architecture continued to play a significant role in shaping community identity. At Göbekli Tepe, monumental enclosures constructed from large stone pillars served as gathering places for ceremonies and symbolic activities. Their circular and oval forms, along with the elaborate carvings of animals and abstract motifs, indicate that these spaces held meaning that extended beyond everyday experience. The effort required to construct and maintain the site suggests coordinated labor from multiple groups, likely drawn from the surrounding region. The absence of domestic structures at Göbekli Tepe reinforces its interpretation as a specialized center of ritual activity, distinct from settlement life, yet deeply connected to the communities who built and frequented it. Within the domestic sphere, symbolic expression also played a central role. Figurines crafted from clay or stone appear in many Neolithic households. Some depict human forms with stylized features, others portray animals or abstract shapes. Their use remains a subject of scholarly discussion, with interpretations ranging from ritual objects to markers of identity or memory. Their distribution across settlements suggests that they were integrated into daily life, serving roles that linked domestic routines to broader symbolic frameworks. Wall paintings, plaster reliefs, and decorative motifs provide additional evidence for symbolic practices embedded within households. At Çatalhöyük, walls were periodically replastered and adorned with geometric patterns, animal imagery, or scenes whose meanings remain open to interpretation. Some depictions may have referenced communal events, environmental phenomena, or shared beliefs about the world. The repeated renewal of these wall surfaces suggests that decoration was not a one-time activity, but a recurring practice tied to the maintenance of domestic spaces. These artistic expressions, integrated into everyday surroundings, contributed to the shared cultural vocabulary of the community. Community structure also reflected emerging forms of task differentiation. Households often specialized in particular aspects of production based on skill, access to materials, or inherited traditions. Some areas of settlements contain high concentrations of flint-knapping debris, indicating zones where toolmaking occurred repeatedly. Other areas show evidence of specialized food preparation, plaster production, or animal processing. These spatial patterns point to informal forms of specialization, where certain households or individuals took on roles supported by community expectations rather than formal authority. Ritual practices serve to reinforce communal bonds and shared identities. Whether expressed through gatherings in communal buildings, daily encounters with symbolic objects, or participation in ceremonies at regional ritual centers, these practices created frameworks through which communities understood their place in the world. Ritual expression helped maintain community cohesion, especially in densely populated settlements where cooperation and social negotiation were essential for stability. The relationship between ritual and daily life is evident in the ways symbolic and practical activities intersected. The same households that processed grain and tended animals also engaged in plastering walls with symbolic motifs. The same communities that constructed communal storage facility. These participated in ceremonies at nearby ritual sites. Such overlapping spheres reveal how early Neolithic societies integrated symbolic expression into the practical tasks of everyday existence, reinforcing a sense of continuity between the physical and social worlds. By the end of this period, communities had developed intricate social structures that balanced household autonomy with cooperation, daily labor with ritual expression, and continuity with innovation. Their settlements embodied the connections between ancestors, neighbors, and shared traditions. Within these spaces, social cohesion took shape through the interplay of architecture, ritual, and the rhythms of daily life, forming a stable foundation for the growing complexity of Neolithic societies. Between approximately 8500 and 5000 BCE, Neolithic communities across Southwest Asia, Anatolia, Southeastern Europe, and adjacent regions became increasingly connected through networks of exchange that extended far beyond the boundaries of individual settlements. These networks emerged gradually from patterns of movement, seasonal gatherings, shared traditions, and the circulation of valued materials. Over time, they linked distant communities into broad interaction spheres, shaping technological innovation, symbolic life, and the spread of domesticated plants and animals. Although the scale of these networks varied by region, their cumulative effect transformed the social and economic landscape of the early Holocene. One of the clearest indicators of long-distance contact during this period is the movement of obsidian. This volcanic glass, prized for its sharpness and suitability for toolmaking, originated from limited geological sources, notably in central and eastern Anatolia. Archaeological evidence shows that obsidian from these sources traveled hundreds of kilometers, appearing in settlements throughout the Levant, northern Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and the Balkans. The distribution of obsidian flakes, blades, and cores across such wide areas reflects structured pathways of movement. These pathways may have been maintained through seasonal travel, regional gatherings, or sustained alliances among distant groups. The presence of obsidian in diverse contexts, households, workshops, and ritual structures, demonstrates that it played multiple roles within Neolithic societies, serving both utilitarian and symbolic purposes. Shells from Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf coastlines likewise circulated widely among inland settlements. Their appearance in burial contexts, decorative objects, and personal ornaments suggests that marine shells held symbolic value in regions far from the sea. The distances involved in their transport indicate that coastal and inland communities participated in long-distance exchange networks, either directly or through intermediary groups. Some shells were modified into beads or pendants before reaching inland settlements, while others were shaped within the receiving communities. Their presence reveals not only aesthetic or symbolic preferences, but also stable channels of contact that persisted across generations. Stone tools and raw materials also traveled between regions. High-quality flint, andesite, and other stones suitable for tool production were exchanged across considerable distances, often moving from areas with rich geological deposits to settlements where such materials were scarce. In some cases, finished tools circulated, while in others communities acquired raw materials and shaped them locally. The spread of particular tool forms, such as standardized blade cores or polished axes, provides evidence for technological diffusion through these networks. Styles of tool production often overlapped across regions, reflecting shared knowledge that may have been transmitted through direct contact or through the repeated movement of skilled individuals. Pigments including ochre, hematite, and other colored minerals also formed part of interregional exchange systems. These materials appear in ritual contexts, wall paintings, plastered structures, and burial assemblages, highlighting their symbolic importance. The movement of pigments demonstrates that communities sought not only practical goods, but also materials that held aesthetic or ceremonial value. Their circulation may have reinforced shared symbolic repertoires across distant regions, contributing to the cohesion of broad cultural networks. The spread of domesticated species provides another lens through which to view interregional interaction. Domesticated wheat, barley, and pulses moved gradually from their early centers in the Fertile Crescent into Anatolia, Iran, the Caucasus, and southeastern Europe. This diffusion occurred over many centuries, following pathways shaped by human movement and cultural contact. In some regions, crops were adopted alongside local wild species, creating hybrid systems of cultivation adapted to local climates. Similarly, domesticated sheep and goats expanded their range, reaching areas where wild progenitors were absent. Their spread reflects not only the movement of animals, but also the transmission of knowledge related to herding, breeding, and landscape management. These patterns of exchange raise important questions about the motivations behind early interregional interactions. Scholars debate whether materials circulated primarily due to practical needs, such as obtaining raw materials unavailable locally, or whether social factors played a more significant role. Some interpret the movement of valued goods, such as obsidian blades or marine shells, as part of alliance-building practices that reinforced relationships between communities. Others suggest that exchange was embedded within social obligations tied to marriage, seasonal gatherings, or collective rituals. While it is difficult to determine the precise motivations behind each instance of exchange, the wide distribution of materials suggests that these networks served multiple purposes simultaneously. Seasonal gatherings likely played a significant role in maintaining interregional connections. Such gatherings may have occurred at sites located near resource-rich zones, ritual centers, or traditional meeting places. Communities could exchange goods, share knowledge, renew alliances, and participate in communal activities that reinforced social ties. Archaeological evidence from certain sites, such as concentrations of feasting debris, large communal structures, or symbolic architecture, supports the idea that gatherings served as focal points for regional interaction. At Göbekli Tepe, for instance, the construction and use of monumental enclosures may have drawn groups from surrounding areas, creating an environment conducive to the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The movement of people also contributed to the spread of knowledge across regions. Individuals skilled in particular crafts, such as flint knapping, plaster production, or symbolic carving, may have traveled between communities, transmitting techniques and influencing local traditions. The appearance of similar architectural forms, tool types, or decorative motifs in distant settlements suggests that cultural ideas circulated alongside material goods. Such diffusion did not result in uniformity. Rather, communities adapted new elements to local contexts, creating regional traditions with shared foundations. Interregional interaction also appears in the diversity of stylistic traditions found in symbolic artifacts. Figurines, ornaments, and decorated objects show overlapping themes across regions, suggesting shared symbolic frameworks. Yet local variations in style, form, and motif indicate that communities drew upon broader traditions while maintaining their unique cultural identities. This balance between shared influences and local expression reflects the dynamic interplay between connection and diversity within early Neolithic networks. By the middle of the 7th millennium BCE, these networks had become deeply embedded in the structure of Neolithic life. Communities across Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and southeastern Europe were no longer isolated units, but participants in broader systems of interaction that shaped their technologies, subsistence practices, and symbolic worlds. Through the steady movement of materials, knowledge, and perhaps people themselves, the early Neolithic landscape became a mosaic of interconnected regions. As the period between 8500 and 5000 BCE progressed, The networks linking Neolithic communities became increasingly structured, forming stable channels through which goods, knowledge, and cultural practices circulated. These interactions did not require large-scale migrations or formal institutions. Rather, they evolved gradually through repeated contacts, seasonal movements, visits between neighboring villages, shared rituals, and the continued transmission of traditions across generations. Over time, these movements strengthened regional identities while also fostering connections that crossed ecological, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. One of the most significant features of these networks was their flexibility. Exchange could occur through direct encounters between settlements only a day's walk apart, or through relay systems in which goods passed through multiple communities before reaching their final destinations. Obsidian is a clear example of this phenomenon. Analyses of obsidian artifacts using geochemical techniques reveal that even distant settlements possessed material from multiple Anatolian sources. This diversity indicates that communities actively maintained access to different supply routes, whether through reciprocal exchange, seasonal travel, or regional gatherings. The circulation of obsidian extended into Cyprus and the Aegean, demonstrating the adaptability of Neolithic exchange even across maritime environments. Marine shells followed similar pathways. Their presence in inland settlements suggests that communities along coastlines participated in networks that extended well beyond their immediate surroundings. Shells often appear in modified forms, drilled, polished, or shaped into beads, indicating that symbolic or aesthetic qualities influenced their movement. The wide geographic spread of these ornaments suggests shared preferences that transcended local cultures. Some shells found in inland burials likely signaled connections to distant regions, serving as reminders of broad social worlds in which communities participated, even if indirectly. The movement of crops and domesticated animals provides further insight into how interregional interactions shaped Neolithic transformations. As wheat, barley, and pulses expanded beyond their initial centers of domestication, they entered landscapes where cultivation practices were adapted to local soils, rainfall patterns, and temperatures. This adaptation required detailed knowledge, including when to plant, how to manage early growth, and how to time harvests. Such knowledge likely circulated through interpersonal contact, visitors observing new practices, households incorporating unfamiliar crops, or small groups relocating and bringing seeds with them. In southeastern Europe, the earliest agricultural communities acquired not only domesticated species, but also architectural forms, tool types, and symbolic practices that show clear connections to Southwest Asian traditions. These connections reflect the importance of human movement, whether short-term visits or longer-term relocations, in shaping the spread of Neolithic lifeways. Herd animals followed similar patterns of diffusion. Domesticated sheep and goats moved from their early centers in the Zagros and Taurus regions into Anatolia, Cyprus, northern Syria, and the Levant. Their appearance in these areas required not only the transfer of animals, but also the transmission of herding knowledge, techniques for managing breeding cycles, protecting herds, and balancing grazing pressure across landscapes. These practices were likely shared through direct contact among communities. Indeed, some archaeological sites with early domesticated fauna also exhibit imported materials such as obsidian, suggesting that multiple forms of exchange were intertwined. Regional gatherings played a significant role in maintaining these networks. Although archaeological evidence cannot reveal the full nature of such events, some sites exhibit patterns consistent with temporary aggregation of large groups. Concentrations of animal bones from mass butchery, accumulations of feasting debris, or unusually large structures set apart from domestic areas all point to communal activities that transcended the routines of daily life. These gatherings may have provided opportunities for exchange, marriage alliances, information sharing, and shared ritual practices. They likely strengthened relationships among communities that did not interact regularly, reinforcing social ties across broad regions. Ritual centers such as Göbekli Tepe and other contemporaneous sites may have played roles in facilitating interregional contacts. Their monumental architecture and elaborate imagery suggest that they served as focal points for groups drawn from multiple settlements. The scale of construction, quarrying, carving, transporting, and erecting large stone pillars would have required coordination among groups who did not reside permanently at the site. Such cooperative projects may have strengthened alliances, transmitted symbolic traditions, and provided settings for the exchange of materials that traveled long distances. Although the exact nature of interaction at these sites remains debated, their regional significance appears evident from the archaeological record. Cultural diffusion is visible not only in material goods, but also in the spread of symbolic motifs and artistic traditions. Similar figurine types, geometric designs, and decorative patterns appear across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. These shared motifs suggest that communities participated in overlapping symbolic worlds, exchanging not only goods, but also meanings. In some cases, motifs appear to have been adapted to local traditions, illustrating a dialogue between shared influences and regional identity. This interplay between commonality and variation highlights how Neolithic networks shaped cultural landscapes. The flow of knowledge within these networks also contributed to technological innovation. In some regions, the adoption of pottery appears to have been influenced by long-distance contact with communities already practicing ceramic production. Other technologies, such as the plastering of walls, the construction of lime-based surfaces, and the shaping of polished stone tools, spread along similar routes. These innovations often appeared in clusters, suggesting that communities adopted interconnected suites of practices rather than isolated techniques. The pathways of diffusion reveal that Neolithic societies learned from one another through sustained contact, observation, and adaptation. Interregional networks also served economic functions grounded in risk management. Communities living in environments with fluctuating resources might have benefited from exchange as a way to supplement local shortages. Even small-scale exchanges, such as acquiring obsidian blades from distant regions or trading excess grain for tools, reduced the vulnerability associated with settlement-based lifeways. Such strategies contributed to the resilience of early farming societies as they navigated uncertainties associated with new subsistence systems, climatic variation, and growing population densities. By the end of this period, networks connecting Neolithic communities formed a complex web of relationships that encompassed much of the Near East and extended into southeastern Europe. These networks facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and practices that shaped the trajectory of early agricultural societies. Through continuous interactions, direct or indirect, communities became participants in regional systems that linked diverse landscapes and cultural traditions. Within this connected world, Neolithic villages retained their local identities while also engaging with broader spheres of knowledge and exchange. These interactions did not erase regional diversity. Instead, they contributed to the mosaic of practices, technologies, and beliefs that characterized the Neolithic era. Through steady, enduring contact across regions, early communities shaped one another in ways that fostered cultural continuity, technological development, and the gradual spread of agricultural lifeways across vast distances. Between roughly 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, Neolithic communities across Afro-Eurasia experienced a period of pronounced technological expansion and growing regional differentiation. Earlier phases of the Neolithic had established the foundations of cultivation, herding, permanent settlement, and household production. Now, these foundations supported an increasingly diverse array of material practices. Innovations in pottery, stone tool manufacture, textile production, and construction spread across large areas, yet each region incorporated these innovations according to its own environmental conditions, social traditions, and cultural preferences. The result was a mosaic of local technological systems, each shaped by particular histories and landscapes, yet connected through broader patterns of interaction. Pottery provides one of the clearest examples of technological refinement during this period. Early ceramic vessels had often been thick-walled, simple in form, and fired at variable temperatures. By the 7th millennium BCE, communities in many regions had developed more controlled firing methods, allowing for thinner walls, stronger surfaces, and greater uniformity. Decorative techniques also expanded. Impressed, incised, painted, and combed designs appear in different areas, each reflecting local styles and aesthetic values. In some regions, such as parts of the Near East and southeastern Europe, pottery was produced in large quantities, forming extensive assemblages that demonstrate both practical and symbolic use. Elsewhere, like in certain zones of South Asia, pottery emerged more gradually, shaped by local needs and available raw materials. Advances in stone tool production continued to shape daily life and settlement organization. Polished axes, adzes, and chisels became widespread, reflecting increased investment in woodworking. These tools enabled communities to construct more durable houses, carve beams and posts with greater precision, and clear land for cultivation. Polishing required long hours of grinding against abrasive stones, suggesting that tool production had become an established aspect of household or small group labor. The adoption of polished stone tools across many regions marks an important shift toward more intensive landscape modification, as communities expanded fields, maintained irrigation features in some areas, and altered wooded environments through selective cutting. Textile production also grew increasingly sophisticated. Spindle whorls, loom weights, and impressions of woven fabrics indicate that weaving was becoming a regular component of household activity. These developments built upon earlier spinning traditions, but during this period weaving itself became more standardized. Fabrics appear to have been made from plant fibers in many regions, and in some areas animal fibers began to play a larger role as herded species changed through continued domestication. Textile production required coordinated skill, spinning fibers into thread, setting up looms, and weaving consistent patterns across finished cloth. These tasks became embedded in the rhythms of domestic life, contributing to the growing material complexity of Neolithic households. Advancements in construction further transformed settlement landscapes. In many regions, houses became larger and more robust, incorporating multi-room layouts, plastered floors, and carefully shaped architectural elements. Some settlements developed standardized building plans, suggesting a shared understanding of spatial organization within communities. Roofed courtyards, interior storage chambers, and specialized workspaces appear with increasing frequency. These developments reflect not only technological skill, but also the deeper social integration of household and village life. As communities grew, construction became a collective endeavor, requiring cooperation and shared knowledge among builders. Regional diversification of these technologies can be seen in the emergence of distinctive cultural complexes across Afro-Eurasia. In Central Europe, the linear pottery, LBK, culture developed longhouses arranged in organized patterns across expansive landscapes. These timber structures, often exceeding 20 meters in length, reflect sophisticated woodworking techniques enabled by polished stone tools. LBK communities cultivated wheat and barley, raised cattle, and produced distinctive pottery decorated with linear impressions. Their settlements formed one of the earliest large-scale farming systems in Europe, characterized by dispersed yet interconnected communities anchored by shared traditions. In northern China, the Yangshao culture emerged during the 6th millennium BCE, illustrating another distinctive regional tradition. Yangshao settlements often featured semi-subterranean homes with wattle-land daub construction, central hearths, and surrounding storage pits. Their painted pottery is notable for its fine craftsmanship and ornamental motifs, which included geometric patterns and stylized animal forms. These vessels reflect both practical functions and symbolic expression. The Yangshao culture also demonstrates early forms of millet cultivation and pig husbandry, adapted to the environmental conditions of the Yellow River Basin. Tools, ornaments, and burial customs show that Yangshao communities developed their own material vocabulary, distinct from contemporaneous regions, yet shaped by broader Neolithic patterns. In the Indus region, early farming communities laid the groundwork for later developments that would eventually culminate in the Indus Valley urban tradition. During this period, settlements were often small but well organized, utilizing mud brick construction, storage facilities, and pottery traditions suited to local resources. Archaeobotanical evidence points to the cultivation of barley, wheat, and local pulses, while faunal remains indicate early management of cattle, sheep, and goats. Regional conditions, including the variability of river systems and monsoon patterns, shape the distinct rhythms of life in these communities. Their technological practices, whether in pottery firing, stone tool production, or storage construction, reflect adaptations to these environmental realities. Across these and other regions, the diversification of Neolithic technologies reveals a process shaped by both innovation and inheritance. Communities built upon earlier practices while adapting them to new conditions, producing traditions that were recognizably Neolithic yet deeply local. Shared technologies, such as polished tools or pottery, spread through networks of interaction, but their specific forms reflected regional preferences and ecological constraints. This balance between connection and differentiation became a hallmark of the later Neolithic. As the 7th millennium BCE progressed and new regions adopted cultivation and herding practices, technological traditions continued to branch outward, forming distinct clusters of material culture. Each cluster reflected the interplay between local environments, inherited knowledge, and the creative adaptation of new techniques. These developments marked a transition from the relatively uniform early phases of the Neolithic toward more elaborate and regionally complex settlement systems. As technological practices continued to evolve between 7000 and 4500 BCE, the growing regional diversity in material culture reflected both shared foundations and distinct trajectories. Communities adapted technologies to their own landscapes, social structures, and subsistence strategies, creating traditions that varied widely yet retained common Neolithic roots. Through this gradual diversification, settlements became increasingly complex, not only in their architecture and tools, but also in the ways they organized labor, interacted with their environments, and expressed cultural identity. In Southwest Asia, technological refinement built upon millennia of earlier developments. Pottery traditions grew more specialized, with vessels produced in a variety of shapes suited to storage, cooking, and serving. Some settlements experimented with thicker slip coatings or decorative motifs applied before firing. The increased durability and variety of vessel forms supported more intricate cooking practices and allowed for the preservation of foods in ways that protected them from moisture and pests. These improvements in pottery coincided with continued innovations in plaster production, wall construction, and floor surfacing, each of which contributed to the comfort and stability of domestic environments. Anatolia, already a center for earlier advances, experienced further technological elaboration. The use of lime plaster became more sophisticated, allowing for smoother surfaces and the creation of more durable structures. Communities refined techniques for producing plaster reliefs and painted wall decorations, integrating symbolic and aesthetic elements into daily surroundings. Stone tool industries also expanded, with increased emphasis on finely polished axes and adzes suited for clearing vegetation and modifying wood. These tools facilitated the expansion of cultivated zones, contributing to the intensification of agricultural practices in some areas. Further west, in southeastern Europe, early farming communities adopted technologies that blended local traditions with newly introduced practices. The linear pottery culture, LBK, with its distinctive pottery and longhouse architecture, illustrates the integration of imported Neolithic crops and animals with regional environmental conditions. LBK settlements often contained specialized zones for flint knapping, food storage, and processing, indicating a division of space that paralleled the division of labor within households. Longhouses themselves represented significant architectural commitments, requiring coordinated construction efforts and suster. In maintenance, their standardized forms suggest shared building knowledge transmitted across generations and communities. In the Balkans, pottery traditions evolved rapidly, developing characteristic forms decorated with incised or painted designs. These stylistic conventions differed from those of the LBK and reflect the local creativity of communities who combined new technologies with pre-existing cultural preferences. Polished stone tools also appeared in increasing numbers, showing that communities in this region participated in broader technological trends while adapting them to local needs, including forest clearing and the construction of durable dwellings. In the eastern regions of the Neolithic world, early farming communities of the Indus region began developing material traditions that responded to fluctuating river systems and monsoon cycles. Pottery assemblages from this area demonstrate a growing sophistication in firing techniques and vessel shapes. Thick-walled jars suited for grain storage, shallow bowls for food preparation, and small cups for daily use indicate a diversity of activities centered within households. Stone tools also reveal specialized forms tailored to processing cereals, shaping wooden implements, and preparing hides. The appearance of distinct regional pottery styles suggests that communities were developing their own identity markers, shaped by environmental conditions and local cultural expressions. In northern China, the Yangshao culture continued to refine its material traditions. Painted pottery, often fired in well-controlled conditions, featured designs that combined geometric patterns with stylized images of animals or human figures. These vessels may have served both everyday and ceremonial purposes. Their widespread distribution across settlements points to a shared symbolic vocabulary that reinforced community identity. Other technological elements, such as the shaping of stone spades, the construction of storage pits, and the production of textile tools, illustrate a complex household economy integrated with cultivation and animal management practices suited to the Yellow River Basin. Advancements in textile production further contributed to regional diversification. In some areas, loom weights indicate the use of vertical looms capable of producing larger textiles. Differences in spindle whorl sizes across regions reflect variations in thread thickness, possibly linked to the types of plants or animal fibers available locally. These differences reveal how textile technology adapted to material conditions while expanding the range of household production. As communities refined their technologies, craft specialization grew more recognizable. Although not formalized into full-time occupations, certain households or individuals excelled in tasks such as stone polishing, pottery production, textile weaving, or decorative carving. The spatial distribution of artifacts within settlements, clusters of flint waste, concentrations of pottery sherds, or specific work installations, shows that these activities often occurred in designated areas. Such spatial organization indicates growing complexity in household economies and the beginnings of differentiated roles within communities. In many regions, construction techniques also became more regionalized. Villages in the Near East often used mud brick and timber, while European farming communities relied heavily on timber-framed structures supported by waterland daub walls. In parts of China, semi-subterranean houses with earthen walls remained common, reflecting environmental adaptations suited to insulation and temperature stability. These architectural choices were shaped by resource availability, local climate, and inherited building traditions. The diversity of forms highlights the adaptability of Neolithic technology to a wide range of settings. The growing scale of settlements during this period further reinforced technological differentiation. As populations expanded, communities required more robust construction, larger storage facilities, and more efficient tools. New challenges emerged, including the management of refuse, maintenance of shared spaces, and organization of labor. Settlements developed pathways, courtyards, and zones dedicated to particular crafts or communal activities. Such spatial differentiation reflects a maturation of settlement planning, influenced by both social and technological considerations. Ritual practices also contributed to regional diversification. Although symbolic traditions often shared broad themes, ancestor veneration, animal symbolism, geometric designs, the specific forms of ritual architecture and iconic motifs varied widely. Painted pottery in China, figurines in Anatolia, decorative stones in southeastern Europe, and plastered ritual spaces in the Levant all represent distinct expressions of shared Neolithic symbolic worlds. These differences did not weaken interregional connections, rather, they highlight how communities adapted common influences to create locally meaningful traditions. By the late 6th and early 5th millennia BCE, Neolithic technologies had diversified to such an extent that distinct regional cultures emerged across Afro-Eurasia. These traditions reflected the interplay of environmental adaptation, cultural innovation, and continued interaction with neighboring regions. The technological advancements of this period laid the groundwork for increasingly complex social, economic, and ritual systems, shaping the character of Neolithic lifeways as they transitioned toward more elaborate settlement structures. Within this landscape of regional diversity, communities continued to refine their tools, architecture, and symbolic practices in ways that responded to local conditions while preserving connections to broader networks of knowledge. Through these steady developments, the Neolithic world grew richer and more varied, forming the foundations upon which many later cultural traditions would build. Between approximately 5000 and 3500 BCE, many regions across Southwest Asia, Southeastern Europe, and parts of South and East Asia entered a period of gradual but significant transformation. Earlier Neolithic lifeways, characterized by small clustered villages, mixed farming and herding, and household-based production, did not disappear. Instead, they evolved, producing larger settlements, more specialized crafts, expanded systems of cultivation, and increasingly structured social landscapes. These developments unfolded unevenly across regions, yet their cumulative effect signaled the emergence of more complex forms of community life. One of the most visible changes during this period was the growth of settlement size. Villages that had once housed small clusters of households now expanded to include dozens or even hundreds of structures. In parts of northern Mesopotamia, such as the plains surrounding the Tigris and Euphrates, large tell sites began to form from the accumulated debris of successive building phases. These mounded settlements, rising gradually above the surrounding landscape, reflected centuries of continuous occupation and rebuilding. Their size indicates rising population densities as households constructed dwellings in increasingly close proximity. Similar patterns appeared in southeastern Europe, where long-lived villages grew into substantial habitation mounds, some with carefully planned layouts and defined communal spaces. As settlements expanded, the surrounding agricultural systems grew more intensive. In many areas, communities developed larger field systems to support the needs of growing populations. Archaeobotanical evidence shows increased reliance on domesticated cereals and pulses, with some regions adopting new crops introduced through long-distance interaction. The expansion of cultivation often required coordinated labor, especially where irrigation or land clearance played roles in enabling agricultural productivity. In parts of northern Mesopotamia, early irrigation channels appear in the archaeological record, suggesting that communities were experimenting with water management techniques that would later become hallmarks of more complex societies. Herd management also intensified. Faunal remains from many late Neolithic sites reveal increasing proportions of sheep, goats, and cattle, reflecting deliberate strategies for meat, milk, hide, and traction use. In some regions, evidence suggests that herding practices became partially specialized, with certain households or groups managing larger or more carefully organized flocks. These changes required not only practical knowledge of animal behavior, but also social frameworks that defined responsibilities and access to shared grazing grounds. The integration of animals into broader economic systems contributed to the rising complexity of late Neolithic lifeways. Craft specialization became more pronounced during this era. While households remained centers of production, certain tasks, such as pottery manufacturing, stone tool production, textile weaving, plasterwork, and bead making, began to exhibit higher levels of skill and standardization. Pottery workshops appeared in some settlements, identifiable through clusters of kilns, masses of production debris, and uniform vessel forms. The refinement of ceramic technology allowed for thinner walls, more stable firing, and a greater range of shapes. Decorative traditions also diversified, reflecting both regional styles and the preferences of specialized craftspeople. Stone tool production underwent similar developments. Large-scale blade production systems appear in some late Neolithic settlements, indicating that highly skilled knappers produced standardized implements that circulated across regions. Polished stone tools became more sophisticated, with axes and adzes crafted to shapes optimized for specific tasks, such as clearing land or shaping timber. These tools supported intensified agriculture and construction, reinforcing the connections between craft specialization and broader economic expansion. Evidence for early metallurgical experimentation emerges during this period as well. In parts of Anatolia, the Balkans, and Iran, communities began working with native copper, cold hammering it into small tools, beads, and decorative items. Although copper objects were not yet common, their presence marks an important technological shift. Metallurgy remained limited in scale, and stone tools continued to dominate daily life. Nonetheless, the appearance of metalworking indicates that communities were exploring new materials and techniques, innovations that would later play central roles in shaping Bronze Age societies. The growth of long-distance exchange networks contributed to these transformations. Obsidian continued to circulate widely, but now it did so alongside new materials, including copper, shell ornaments, exotic stones, and distinctive pottery styles. Exchange route. It extended across Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia, the Zagros Highlands, the Caucasus, southeastern Europe, and in some cases into the Iranian Plateau and South Asia. These networks did not simply transfer goods, they facilitated the movement of ideas, techniques, and cultural practices. The diffusion of pottery forms, decorative motifs, and building methods suggests ongoing interaction between communities separated by considerable distances. As exchange networks expanded, subtle forms of social differentiation began to appear within settlements. Differences in house size, internal layout, storage capacity, and access to high-value goods suggest that households did not all occupy identical positions within community life. Some dwellings contained more storage facilities or higher quality construction, indicating greater productive capacity or social influence. Burial practices provide additional clues. In several regions, grave goods become more varied, with some individuals interred with ornaments, finely crafted tools, or distinctive pottery. Although social hierarchy remained limited compared to later periods, these emerging distinctions reveal a world in which social roles were beginning to diversify. Proto-urban sites began to appear in parts of northern Mesopotamia during the late 5th and early 4th millennia BCE. Settlements such as Tel Brak grew to impressive sizes, with neighborhoods, communal structures, and areas of specialized production. These sites did not yet possess the administrative systems or monumental architecture characteristic of later urban societies, but their scale and organization mark them as early steps toward urban development. Their emergence reflects broader trends toward population concentration, economic intensification, and increasing complexity in social relationships. Even with these transformations, late Neolithic societies remained diverse. Some regions shifted rapidly toward larger settlements and intensified production, while others maintained smaller village-based lifeways. Environmental variability played a role, as did cultural traditions and historical trajectories unique to each region. In many areas, household autonomy remained strong, and communal decision-making continued to guide settlement organization. Yet the cumulative changes, from rising population densities to emerging craft specialization and expanding exchange networks, signaled that Neolithic societies were entering new phases of complexity. These developments reflect a world in transition. The foundations laid in earlier millennia, cultivation, herding, permanent settlements, and symbolic practices, now supported larger and more interconnected communities. Through steady adjustments in subsistence, craft production, and social organization, late Neolithic societies created the conditions in which more complex economic and political forms would eventually arise. As the centuries between 5000 and 3500 BCE unfolded, the social and economic landscapes of many Neolithic regions continued to expand in scale and complexity. Earlier patterns of village-based life persisted, but they now operated within broader systems shaped by intensified production, denser populations, and increasingly structured interactions between settlements. These gradual changes did not produce uniform outcomes. Instead, they generated a mosaic of regional trajectories, each reflecting local environments, inherited traditions, and the cumulative effects of long-term human occupation. Within growing settlements, architectural developments reveal important indicators of emerging complexity. Houses became more differentiated in size, internal arrangement, and construction quality. Some dwellings featured larger storage chambers or multiple rooms dedicated to specific household activities. Others included thicker walls, plastered surfaces, or elevated platforms, suggesting greater investment in comfort and durability. These differences imply that certain households possessed greater productive capacity, whether through larger herds, more expansive fields, or enhanced craft specialization. Although these distinctions did not constitute formal social hierarchy, they point to gradual diversification of roles and resources within communities. Communal spaces evolved alongside household structures. Larger settlements often incorporated open areas for gatherings, seasonal ceremonies, or shared labor. Paths worn through repeated movement indicate that communities developed established routes connecting neighborhoods, work areas, and external fields. In some sites, Structures resembling early storage magazines appear, suggesting that certain communities managed surplus foods or shared resources at a level above individual households. These facilities, whether simple storage buildings or larger communal rooms, reflect increasing coordination within settlements that now supported larger populations. Craft production also became more organized. In several regions, pottery production shifted from small household batches to larger, more standardized output. Kiln structures, though still relatively simple, became more common, offering greater control over firing temperatures. Pottery styles diversified, reflecting regional identities through shapes, colors, and decorative motifs. Some designs became locally characteristic and widely recognized, functioning as cultural markers within expanding interaction networks. The distribution of these styles across regions suggests that communities not only produced distinctive pottery, but also circulated it through established exchange channels. Stone tool industries experienced similar refinement. Workshops dedicated to large-scale blade production appear in certain settlements, identifiable by dense concentrations of napping debris. Specialized tools, such as long, carefully shaped blades, polished axes, and finely crafted points, indicate advanced skill and significant labor investment. These tools supported increasingly intensive agriculture, woodworking, and construction. Their standardization across regions suggests that certain techniques spread widely through networks of exchange and shared knowledge. Metalworking, still limited in scale, also contributed to technological diversification. Communities in Anatolia, the Balkans, and Iran experimented with native copper, producing beads, pins, small tools, and ornaments. The use of metal objects in burials, domestic contexts, and ritual spaces reveals that early metallurgy held both functional and symbolic significance. Although stone remained the primary tool material, the presence of copper marks a transition toward new technological horizons. Expansion of exchange networks during this period further shaped regional developments. Materials such as obsidian, copper, shell ornaments, decorative stones, and specialized pottery spread across vast distances. Some regions participated in long-established routes linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Zagros, and southeastern Europe. Others integrated into newer pathways that brought goods into the Indus region, the Iranian plateau, and Central Asia. The movement of these materials suggests not only economic exchange, but also the circulation of ideas and practices that influenced settlement organization, technology, and symbolic traditions. Growing participation in long-distance exchange also appears to have influenced social organization. Households with greater involvement in exchange networks, whether through access to valued materials or through specialized production, may have acquired roles that distinguish them from others. These distinctions remain subtle in the archaeological record, yet variations in burial goods, house size, or workshop remains suggest emerging differences in status or economic influence. In some regions, individuals were interred with ornaments, tools, or ceramics that indicate symbolic or economic prominence, though these patterns remained far from the formal social stratification seen in later periods. The agricultural systems of the late Neolithic expanded in scale and complexity. Larger settlement sizes required broader cultivation zones, leading to increased land clearance and, in some regions, early water management strategies. Archaeobotanical evidence from northern Mesopotamia indicates that communities experimented with simple irrigation or floodwater control to support more dependable yields. Herding systems also intensified, with larger flocks and more structured patterns of seasonal movement. These developments required careful coordination and a growing understanding of landscape management, reflecting the increasing sophistication of subsistence strategies. Some regions began to exhibit early signs of proto-urban development. Northern Mesopotamian sites such as Tel Brak, grew into substantial centers, featuring dense clusters of buildings, open communal areas, and specialized production zones. Their size and organization suggest more complex economic systems and broader regional influence. While these settlements lacked the administrative frameworks or monumental architecture of later urban societies, they mark an important intermediate stage between early village life and the emergence of cities. In southeastern Europe, large tell settlements became focal points for regional interactions. Their long sequences of occupation reflect gradual growth shaped by household continuity, technological innovation, and expanding agricultural systems. These communities often develop distinctive pottery styles and symbolic traditions, reinforcing local identities within wider networks of exchange. Their growth illustrates how regional environments, rich river valleys, fertile plains, and forested uplands, shape the pace and character of Neolithic transformations. The symbolic and ritual dimensions of community life also evolved during this period. Across many regions, ritual architecture became more integrated into settlement layouts. Some sites feature shrines, communal rooms, or decorated spaces that appear to have hosted shared ceremonies. Figurines, ritual vessels, and symbolic motifs indicate that communities continued to express cultural values through material culture. These practices helped maintain social cohesion within growing settlements, reinforcing shared beliefs as populations expanded and social roles diversified. Despite variations in scale and form, late Neolithic communities across Afro-Eurasia shared common challenges: managing larger populations, coordinating increasingly complex economic activities, and sustaining social cohesion within expanding settlements. Their responses to these challenges, whether through technological innovation, spatial reorganization, or symbolic expression, shaped the emergence of new social landscapes. By the end of this period, the cumulative effects of rising population densities, intensified production, growing craft specialization, and expanding exchange networks had transformed many Neolithic societies. While formal political institutions had not yet developed, the foundations for more complex organizations were taking shape. Settlements were larger, more interconnected, and more internally differentiated than ever before, marking the final stages of the Neolithic before the widespread adoption of metallurgy and the emergence of early urban societies. Between roughly 4000 and 3000 BCE, communities across Afro-Eurasia moved through a gradual transition that carried them from the established traditions of the Neolithic into the emerging worlds of the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. This transition was not marked by abrupt change. Instead, it unfolded slowly, shaped by the continued use of familiar practices alongside the adoption of new materials, technologies, and forms of regional interaction. Agricultural systems that had been refined over millennia remained central to daily life. Households continued to cultivate long-domesticated cereals and pulses, tend herds of sheep, goats, and cattle, and manage fields laid out in patterns that had taken shape during earlier eras. These continuities provided stability even as new elements began to enter the social and technological landscape. In many long-settled regions, villages that had grown steadily throughout the Neolithic persisted with only gradual modifications to their layout and internal organization. Households continued to construct dwellings using locally available resources, mud brick, timber, stone, and thatch, maintaining traditions that had proven effective across generations. At some sites, architectural forms became more formalized, and in certain areas houses grew larger, with more defined internal spaces. These changes reflect the accumulation of knowledge concerning construction techniques, as well as the increasing specialization of household activities. Yet the underlying principles of domestic architecture, grounded in the rhythms of cultivation and storage, remained consistent with earlier patterns. Agricultural systems likewise retained strong continuity. The crops central to Neolithic subsistence, emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, lentils, peas, millet, and various regional staples, continued to anchor food production. Communities refined their cultivation strategies based on long familiarity with local soils and seasonal cycles. In some regions, irrigation networks expanded, supporting higher productivity, while in others rain-fed agriculture persisted in forms that had been effective for centuries. Herd management grew more structured, with evidence of selective breeding and more deliberate control over herd composition. These developments continued trends established in earlier millennia, demonstrating how deeply embedded agricultural knowledge had become within community lifeways. Against this backdrop of continuity, new technological possibilities began to shape daily life. Metallurgy, still in its early stages during the late Neolithic, expanded cautiously but steadily. Communities in Anatolia, southeastern Europe, Iran, and the Caucasus experimented increasingly with copper, producing small tools, ornaments, and symbolic objects. The techniques remained simple, cold hammering, and in some places early annealing, but the presence of metal items reflects growing familiarity with the material. Even so, stone tools retain their primary role, especially for tasks requiring durability. The coexistence of stone and metal technologies illustrates the gradual nature of technological transition, as communities incorporated new materials without discarding established ones. Long-distance exchange networks adapted to these expanding technological practices. Copper, once obtained only from limited sources, began to circulate more widely, joining obsidian, shell ornaments, decorative stones, pigments, and pottery styles that had traveled across regions for millennia. These networks did not necessarily increase in scale, but they shifted in content and configuration. Some routes persisted largely unchanged, while others expanded toward new regions, linking communities in fresh patterns of interaction. The spread of certain pottery traditions, decorative motifs, and technical practices reveals continued cultural dialogue among distant groups, now incorporating materials linked to emerging Chalcolithic technologies. Ritual traditions also evolved during this transitional era. Many symbolic practices retained deep roots in Neolithic belief systems, yet they adapted to new social and material contexts. Architectural spaces dedicated to ritual began to appear more frequently within settlements, sometimes taking the form of small shrines, decorated rooms, or carefully arranged installations. Figurines, painted objects, and ceremonial vessels remained in use, but their forms and materials diversified, reflecting both continuity and innovation. Burial customs show similar patterns. Some communities continued earlier practices of intramural burial or collective interment, while others began to develop more formalized cemeteries located outside settlements. These changes reflect shifting attitudes toward community memory, identity, and the role of the deceased within social life. Regional variability marked the entire transition period. In parts of northern Mesopotamia, large tell sites expanded further and exhibited early signs of administrative organization, with distinct neighborhoods and areas devoted to specific crafts. In southeastern Europe, long-established tell settlements continued to flourish, developing distinctive ceramic and symbolic traditions even as copper use increased. In the Indus region, early farming communities maintained long-standing agricultural systems while gradually adopting new architectural and craft practices that foreshadowed later developments. In northern China, millet farming societies continued to refine their pottery, weaving, and settlement organization, blending older traditions with new forms of symbolic and economic activity. The persistence of Neolithic practices alongside new innovations reveals a world in which long-term stability supported gradual transformation. Communities relied on knowledge accumulated across generations, integrating new materials and techniques into familiar frameworks rather than replacing earlier systems. This blend of continuity and change shaped the foundations of later cultural developments. Agricultural knowledge developed during the Neolithic continued to inform land use systems well into the Bronze Age and beyond. Settlement patterns established during the Neolithic, clustered houses, shared courtyards, communal work areas, formed the basis for later, more formalized urban layouts. Symbolic traditions, refined over millennia, provided the foundations upon which early monumental and ceremonial practices would later build. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, many regions had entered new cultural phases. Metallurgy became more widely adopted, exchange networks incorporated new materials and broader geographies, and settlement systems grew increasingly complex. Yet these developments rested firmly on Neolithic foundations. The innovations of earlier millennia, domesticated plants and animals, settled communities, shared symbolic traditions, and regional networks of interaction continued to shape the trajectory of human societies. The Neolithic was not a disappeared era, but a deeply embedded foundation, its practices woven into the fabric of emerging Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age worlds. As the 4th millennium BCE advanced, the gradual integration of new materials, expanding networks, and emerging forms of settlement organization continued to reshape the cultural landscapes of many regions. Yet even amid these transitions, the imprint of long-established Neolithic practices remained deeply visible. Communities continued to orient their lives around the agricultural cycles that had guided generations. Fields were tilled and planted following familiar rhythms. Harvests were stored using methods refined through centuries of practice, and herds were managed through well-understood routines of seasonal movement and selective breeding. These enduring patterns offered stability during a period of change and provided a foundation upon which new technologies and social practices could be incorporated. Settlement patterns illustrate this balance between continuity and transformation. In regions such as northern Mesopotamia and southeastern Europe, large tells stood as physical records of cumulative occupation. Each new construction layer rested upon the remains of earlier phases, creating mounded settlements with deep stratigraphic histories. The architecture of these sites often reflected both inherited layouts and gradual modification. Buildings continued to cluster around courtyards and shared working spaces, yet some settlements began to exhibit more complex spatial organization. Distinctive neighborhoods emerged, sometimes with concentrations of particular crafts or specialized activities, suggesting early forms of functional zoning shaped by growing population density and expanding economic roles. In several regions, the scale of construction increased. Certain settlements built more substantial walls, whether for practical purposes or symbolic display. At other sites, communal buildings became more prominent, reflecting the need for spaces large enough to accommodate group activities that now involved wider segments of the population. These buildings, though modest compared to later monumental structures, reveal shifts in how communities organized collective labor and ritual observance. Their emergence suggests the early stages of architectural tradition that would eventually culminate in the ceremonial centers and administrative complexes of later periods. Craft production continued to diversify during this era. Pottery, now deeply integrated into daily life, became more regionally distinctive. In some areas, painted ceramics grew more elaborate, displaying geometric or figurative motifs that reflected local aesthetic traditions. In others, vessels took on standardized shapes suited to new forms of storage, cooking, or ceremonial use. These traditions demonstrate both continuity, rooted in earlier ceramic practices, and innovation shaped by evolving social and economic needs. Metallurgical experimentation expanded slowly but steadily. Communities in Anatolia, southeastern Europe, and the Caucasus produced increasing numbers of copper objects, ranging from decorative items to small tools. Early smelting techniques began to appear, marking a shift from the working of native copper toward more complex processing. These practices, however, remained limited in scale. Metal objects complemented but did not replace stone tools, which retained their importance due to durability and established production skills. The coexistence of stone and metal signifies a transitional phase in which communities explored new materials without abandoning traditional technologies. Exchange networks continued to evolve, supporting the flow of goods, ideas, and cultural practices across vast distances. Copper traveled along routes that connected mining regions with distant settlements. Similarly, distinctive pottery styles, shell ornaments, stone tools, and pigments moved through established pathways. These networks linked communities in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, southeastern Europe, Iran, the Indus region, and northern China. In some areas, exchange intensified as settlements grew into regional hubs, serving as points of convergence for multiple routes. Such hubs played increasing roles in shaping economic interactions and may have influenced the development of early administrative practices. Ritual traditions adapted as settlements became more complex. Many communities continued long-established practices, such as household-based rituals, the use of figurines, and the maintenance of decorated spaces. However, new patterns emerged as well. Larger communal structures began to host ceremonies that involved wider participation, and some regions developed more formalized ritual installations. These shifts did not erase earlier symbolic traditions. Rather, they layered new expressions onto long-standing practices. Burial customs also diversified. Some communities adopted formal cemeteries located outside settlements, while others maintained intramural burial traditions. Differences in grave goods, ranging from simple pottery to copper ornaments, suggest that distinctions in social roles, though not yet sharply defined, were becoming more visible. Regional variability remained a defining feature of this transitional era. In northern Mesopotamia, large settlements with dense populations and emerging proto-urban features hint at trajectories that would later contribute to the formation of early states. In southeastern Europe, tell settlements continued to develop distinctive ceramic traditions and symbolic practices, reflecting long sequences of habitation rooted in local environments. In the Indus region, early farming communities expanded and reorganized their settlements in ways that foreshadowed more complex patterns of urban planning. In northern China, millet farming societies developed increasingly formalized pottery styles, weaving traditions, and settlement layouts, blending continuity with emerging complexity. Despite their differences, these regions shared a common thread: the gradual integration of Neolithic foundations with new technologies and forms of regional interaction. Agricultural systems, established through centuries of careful adaptation, continued to anchor community life. Settlement organization, shaped by long-term occupation and inherited architectural knowledge, provided stable spatial frameworks. Symbolic practices, deeply rooted in earlier traditions, continued to guide rituals, memory, and social cohesion. At the same time, early metallurgy, expanding exchange networks, and growing settlement sizes signaled new trajectories of development that would eventually lead to more formalized political structures and intensified economic systems. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, many of the defining features of later civilizations were beginning to emerge. Communities experimented with new materials, expanded their networks of interaction, and organized their settlements in increasingly complex ways. Yet these changes rested firmly on Neolithic innovations: domestication, cultivation, herding, household production, and enduring symbolic expression. The Neolithic did not disappear abruptly. It became woven into the structure of emerging Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age societies. Through these layered continuities and incremental transformations, the long-term legacy of the Neolithic took shape. Its agricultural systems, settlement patterns, and social practices formed the enduring foundations upon which later civilizations would build, shaping landscapes, economies, and cultural traditions across Afro-Eurasia for millennia to come.